At this Catholic elementary school in Phoenix, Arizona, 11 children contracted childhood leukemia, and 9 of those children died. And in Guilford, Connecticut, 5 brain tumors on a street with only 9 homes. 2 towns, 2 cancer clusters, 2 mysteries. The investigation into these 2 neighborhoods answered some questions, but raised many more. Arizona has always been known for its warm, dry climate and clean desert air. What was once primarily desert and farmland has gradually been transformed. As the population moved west, so did development and industry, and along with it, new environmental problems.
Do we have a problem? Do I need to be concerned? If not, then I'll leave right now. Are you saying no? In all honesty, not to protect your credentials, please.
This public meeting was to voice concerns and get some answers about the unusually high number of childhood leukemia cases in the Phoenix suburb of Maryvale. Between 1961 and 1985, 11 children attending St. Vincent de Paul's Catholic Elementary School developed acute lymphocytic leukemia. 9 of those children died.
Almost every grade had 2 classrooms. And it was a school that had a waiting list to get into. Half the school shut down now. People don't want to send their kids there anymore.
Even more alarming, in the neighborhood surrounding the school, there were 49 cases of childhood leukemia, 2.5 times higher than normal. Ramona Barrett lived in Maryvale when her youngest daughter Jessica developed leukemia and died.
I thought it was maybe something I did while I was pregnant. And I would just rack my brain to think, what happened? What did I do? And I couldn't think of anything that I had done different than with my other 2 children. And, you know, I still don't know. And, I mean, it's always going to bother me the rest of my life.
Sandy Matthews thinks back, too, and remembers her son, Josh, and the 2-year battle he waged against leukemia, but lost.
To sit and hold my child after a radiation treatment when, you know, he's just dry heaving and throwing up, and you can feel his pain, and there's nothing you can do, you know, to take that away. And that's what leukemia came to mean to us, is, you know, watching a loss of life from somebody that was so alive.
The Arizona State Health Department was alarmed. Norm Peterson headed the investigation.
You try to find something that these people have in common. You would like to know, for instance, if all of their parents worked in the same factory, or if all of their mothers had had x-rays while they had been pregnant.
One of the first things investigators tried to discover, is this a true cancer cluster or a random occurrence? If the average rate of cancer in a city is 1 in every 10 households, for example, we assume that the distribution of those cancers will be more or less equal. But if it isn't, and the same number of cancer cases happen in a group or cluster, scientists try to figure out if it's because of chance or if there's a reason for the cluster. The rate of childhood leukemia in Maryvale was higher than it should have been, and the residents first suspected pollution.
We know there's a problem. There are studies that show benzene does cause childhood leukemia. Benzene comes from gasoline. Here's the kids. Here's the area where children have been dying of leukemia. Here's the gas storage facility right here. Do you think it's just coincidence?
The tank farm near the cluster site was suspected of leaking benzene into the atmosphere. Benzene has been linked to leukemia, but not to the type found in the Maryvale cancer cluster.
Cancer is cancer, whether it's leukemia, whether it's cancer of the brain, cancer of the skin, cancer of the stomach, cancer of the lungs. Cancer is cancer.
But researchers say that isn't entirely correct. There are many different kinds of cancer with many different causes. For cancer to develop, 2 things must happen. First, a cell becomes damaged in some way by an inherited defect, or by something like radiation, a virus, or a chemical. Then something has to activate the cell, like the chemicals in cigarette smoke or pollution. The result? Cells which multiply out of control, creating junk piles of abnormal cells called tumors.
For reasons that we don't completely understand, childhood leukemias tend to cluster. And there have been many, many leukemia clusters in children described in the literature.
But what causes a large number of leukemia cases to cluster in a small neighborhood such as Maryvale? Norm Peterson sent detailed questionnaires to the families of the cancer victims and immediately tested the St. Vincent de Paul School.
We immediately went out, did a radiation survey to see that there hadn't been, for instance, some radioactive material incorporated into the structure.
They also tested radiation levels in the schoolyard and surrounding neighborhoods to see if electric power lines or a substation might have been involved. Since much of Maryvale had been farmland back in the 60s and routinely sprayed with insecticides, could this have affected the drinking water? Some residents remembered contaminated wells closed by the city a few years earlier.
The block I grew up on was right smack in the middle of it. It's, looking back, it's very scary, you know, to think that we lived with this and, you know, why.
The citizens of Maryvale wanted answers. Their home values were tumbling, their children dying. What was causing the high rates of childhood leukemia at this Catholic elementary school in Arizona and in the surrounding neighborhood? It was a cancer cluster which took the lives of 32 children and hospitalized 17 others.
You wanted to run away, but then you wanted to move, sell out, let's go away, let's go somewhere else. But you have children who have lives, you have jobs, you have a home. You just cannot walk away from everything.
This absolute, what I would consider destruction of faith, even with the church. Your children are in a Catholic school. You know, you're a practicing Catholic, you think, wow, you know, well, if nothing else, you know, Bishop O'Brien will stand there and say, well, maybe we better do something. Everywhere we turned, we ran into the same stone wall.
It was a rate of cancer more than twice what it should have been, and the residents wanted to know what the state medical detectives were doing about it.
My children go to St. Vincent de Paul. It was focused there. Are my children safe to play there, to drink the water? How long is it going to take? I mean, we're scared, especially since we've been there.
When state epidemiologists reviewed the test results of St. Vincent de Paul School, they learned some shocking information. The air quality, drinking water, levels of pesticides and radiation were all within state and federal safety levels. And they noticed something else. These levels were below those found in other schools and in other neighborhoods. The nearby wells, which had been contaminated, were closed years earlier and weren't used for drinking water. The drinking water from Maryvale was tested and found to be safe. Next, Peterson and his staff investigated the local industries.
We looked at industries from two aspects. We looked at sources of air pollution, and we basically went in and did an inventory of what they were releasing.
But they could identify no toxins in amounts that could be linked with the excess cancers. Peterson was concerned that he might never find the cause of the cancer cluster. Cancer doesn't leave a fingerprint or clue of any kind as to what caused it. And unlike other illnesses, leukemia patients like Josh Phillips produce no antibodies to the cancer-causing agent.
When you get into childhood leukemia, there are no nice, neat little antibodies to anything. There is nothing that says that leukemia is caused by radiation as opposed to being caused by benzene, as opposed to being caused by electromagnetic fields.
So this becomes a much more difficult problem, and so the Achilles heel of environmental epidemiology really is trying to determine what somebody's exposure was many, many years ago.
When the environmental studies couldn't find anything suspicious, Peterson decided to examine the homes where the cancer victims lived. Air, Dust, water, pesticides, heavy metals, and radiation from appliances were all tested to see if these homes differed in any way from others.
Anything that has been shown in some previous study to have been somehow associated with an excess of childhood leukemia, we considered it.
But it was of little help. After 10 years and over $2 million worth of investigation, the Arizona state officials couldn't find anything they could link to the cause of the cancer cluster. But the residents of Maryvale weren't satisfied.
My question is, where is this lack of accepting responsibility in? I mean, when is enough enough? It's the same old question, and we never got an answer for that. Nobody'd ever step up to the podium and say, look, yes, you do have a problem, and yes, we do need to fix it. Let's all get together and fix it.
And how can you say that, you know, that doesn't come back to something? I mean, it has to come back to something in common for all these people. So that's what I feel.
There's a lot of distrust of government. A lot of it is justified. And for the public to not trust us, this should not come as a surprise.
And it now appears the cancer cluster has ended. Since 1986, the cancer rates in the area have dropped dramatically and are now among the lowest in the United States. Either the Maryvale cancer cluster was a random occurrence, or the cancer-causing agent, if there was one, has long since gone.
When we're trying to understand what caused a cancer pattern in a community, we're really trying to find out about an event that occurred 20 or 30 years ago. That's very difficult to do. Imagine what would happen, for example, if you had an automobile accident and instead of your bone breaking right away, it broke 30 years later, right? And then when confronted with somebody with a broken bone, you had to think back over all the other things that might have happened to them over the intervening 20 or 30 years.
But in another town, thousands of miles away, there was another cancer cluster. This time, residents had a suspect. While the residents of Maryvale, Arizona were living through their cancer cluster, another was developing in Connecticut. It was on this dead-end road, Meadow Street in Guilford, Connecticut, a working-class neighborhood in a mostly well-to-do town about 2 hours' drive outside of New York City. Out of 9 homes on this street, there had been 5 brain tumor cases. When Bob Hemstock heard of this unusually high number of brain tumors, he was alarmed. His son and granddaughter lived on Meadow Street.
What is it about Meadow Street? That's probably the best question you could ever ask. Really don't know, except you have a lot of illnesses in a very short street.
Residents were convinced they knew the cause of this high rate of cancer. They blamed the electric substation. It takes up one side of Meadow Street and sits only 100 feet away from the closest houses. Electrical substations transform high voltage power into lower voltages before going through residential power lines into homes. It's a big, noisy neighbor to the residents of Meadow Street, giving off high levels of electromagnetic energy which frightens even scientific researchers.
I wouldn't want to live there. I'll tell you that. I wouldn't. And I certainly wouldn't want my children to be raising their children across the street from a substation. And as a matter of fact, when my daughter was buying a house in a working-class section of Cambridge, I went to look at the house, and there was a step-down transformer outside the room, I would say 3 feet from the room that the baby was going to be in. And I was absolutely opposed to her putting a kid in there.
Dr. Reba Goodman is a cell biologist at Columbia University. She is conducting research to see if electromagnetic fields can change our cells, making them more susceptible to cancer.
With electromagnetic fields, a little bit can be bad, then there can be an increase which will have no effect, then there can be a greater increase that can be very bad, and the whole problem is to find the range within which these fields have an effect at the cellular level.
Life on Meadow Street hasn't been the same since an article in the New Yorker magazine strongly suggested that electromagnetic fields from this substation might be responsible for the illnesses on Meadow Street. Jack Walston remembers Meadow Street. He grew up there, and when he married and started a family, he bought a house just down the street from his parents on Meadow Street. He blames the electric substation for the death of his entire family. His father died of a brain tumor at the age of 54. His sister died at the age of 54. And doctors removed a brain tumor from the front of Jack Walston's head.
I was 35 years old when I had that operation. At that present time, this meningioma tumor that I had was the largest in the history of Yale New Haven Hospital, larger than a large grapefruit. Like I said, I do have a reoccurrence of it.
Melissa Bullock was Jack Walston's next-door neighbor. She was a high school basketball star and straight-A student. She also developed a brain tumor at the age of 16, which required surgery and radiation, but she survived. In 1987, the local newspaper did a little investigation of its own and discovered this startling number of cancer cases, not only around the electric substation, but along the entire length of the high power lines throughout the state.
I can give you name after name of people who lived along the power lines that have died with cancer, malignancy of some type, from one street to another. Some of them were relations, some of them were friends. We, as individuals, will never be able to prove that this is what does it, but I firmly believe this has got a lot to do with it.
The electric company acknowledges that the levels of electromagnetic radiation are high at the substation itself, but that they drop off significantly further away. Bob Carberry is the manager of transmission lines and civil engineering for the power company.
The levels that I've observed on Meadow Street due to power facilities are quite common. If there was a real problem here, it should be showing up in more places than Meadow Street.
The power company says the levels of radiation near the Meadow Street homes are within the normal range. Within normal because radiation exists in nearly every home in the United States. It's produced by electrical wiring, appliances such as microwave ovens and even electric razors. But the electromagnetic radiation from a substation is constant, and the residents weren't convinced that their neighborhood was safe. The residents of Meadow Street wanted answers about the high number of brain tumors on their small street, and they wanted the word from Town Hall if the electric substation might be the cause. They gathered at a public meeting, anxious to hear what health officials had to say, and what they heard they couldn't accept.
Our conclusion is that there is no cancer cluster on Meadow Street in Guilford.
Even though there were 5 brain tumors on a street with only 9 homes, they said since the tumors were different, they didn't qualify as a cancer cluster.
2 of them were benign, so-called tumors, and those were meningiomas that have many known risk factors or associations, and electric and magnetic fields is not one of them.
But one of the brain tumor cases, the one discovered in Melissa Bullock, has been linked to electromagnetic fields.
I defy any one of them to change places with those people on Meadow Street and bring their family there. And I'll guarantee you not one of them would do that.
Researchers have found modestly higher rates of cancer, including leukemia and brain cancer, among workers who are exposed to electromagnetic fields in their jobs. One study found that welders have significantly higher rates of cancer because of their exposure to radiation.
There's been some extremely good epidemiology done, and in fact, there's more epidemiological evidence for the relationship between cancer and magnetic fields today than there was when we accepted the relationship between asbestos and cancer back in 1949.
But other studies have been inconclusive.
One reason why this is a controversial area and why many scientists have refused to accept the epidemiological evidence is because there is no obvious biological mechanism whereby magnetic fields can cause cancer.
There is some evidence to suggest that it's not the level of electromagnetic radiation one is exposed to, but the number of times an individual passes through the field.
People are exposed intermittently. They go in and out of fields for different lengths of time, and laboratory data has shown that these kinds can have a synergistic effect. But the fact is that until we understand how these things affect cells, we're just not going to know.
Scientists may be getting closer to understanding a possible link between magnetic fields and cancer. Dr. Goodman has been studying the effects of electromagnetic fields for more than 15 years at Columbia University.
We don't know whether electromagnetic fields cause cancer. The most likely thing that they do is that they may promote cancer. That is, if the cell or the body is in contact with some environmental toxin and they are also getting some kind of EM field, these two things together could cause cancer, and this has been shown in animal studies.
The residents of Meadow Street found themselves in a difficult situation. Local health officials never said magnetic fields didn't cause cancer. All they can say is it hasn't been proven.
Our conclusions as a Department of Public Health were that we didn't see a cluster of cases that could be identified as from a common cause. But by the other same token, we couldn't say that they couldn't be related to electromagnetic fields or the electrical substation.
It's my personal belief that when a biological mechanism is established, that there will be a very rapid conversion of the doubters of this effect. Right now, this is a controversial area.
I think that in 5 years we'll know what this is all about. I'm very hopeful.
But the scientists' opinions don't mean much to someone like Jack Walston, a man whose family and friends were ravaged by cancer. He already has his answer.
In my opinion, I do believe the electromagnetic fields, low-level radiation, has a lot to do with it. There was a lot of illnesses on this particular street and the surrounding streets.
And when there are 5 brain tumors on a street with only 9 homes, it's difficult for residents to accept that it's merely a coincidence.
I felt as though there's too much that the average public doesn't know. And I wanted to get that word out that there was possibly an animal out there that was killing them and their kids and their family.
I don't feel it's a natural thing for the cases in as many homes as there was, and I never will feel as though it's a natural thing.
2 cities, 2 cancer sites, and 2 unsolved medical mysteries. Public health officials can offer few answers for the residents of Meadow Street and Maryvale, Arizona. And with the lack of definitive information, the result is usually fear and anger. Over the past 22 years, the CDC has investigated over 108 cancer clusters throughout the United States and around the world. It's the premier medical investigative agency in the world. And it has never been able to find the cause for a single cancer cluster. Not one. At the Dallas Pistol and Revolver Club in 1991, Trey Cooley, a young spectator, was watching a shooting competition seated behind an air gun range. He was struck and killed by a stray bullet. This is how ballistics, lasers, and forensic animation solved the riddle of the magic bullet. "14-year-old Trey Cooley. Look at him and you see the all-American boy. Trey attended Bowles Junior High School in Arlington, Texas, near Dallas. He played cello in the school orchestra, played baseball, and was a Boy Scout.
At that age, every kid has the whole world open to him. He could have done anything he wanted to do.
Most of all, he enjoyed spending time with his family. Trey and his father, Butch, were best friends.
We did everything together.
September 29, 1991. Butch Cooley woke early that Saturday morning, then went to wake Trey. The two shared a passion for shooting. Butch was judging a competition. He gave Trey a choice to sleep in or tag along. Trey chose to go with his father.
Trey started shooting when he was 7. He enjoyed it. He shot his first deer when he was 8. He wanted to be a pistol competitor. And he was pretty good at it.
At the Dallas Pistol and Revolver Club, Trey volunteered to help out by running results from judges to the official scorer. In between assignments, he sat in the airgun building to get out of the hot Texas sun. He sat just inside the door near 2 women who were working as scorers. But behind people shooting air pistols, nothing more than pellet and BB guns. Then, a blood-curdling scream. Trey Cooley slumped to the floor, blood flowing from his temple. His baseball cap had a tiny but telltale hole. Butch Cooley was outside the building, just a few yards from his son when he heard the screaming. Although Butch Cooley spent 21 years as a state trooper and was trained to handle emergencies, no training could prepare him for what he saw next.
When I got there, I saw that he'd been shot. I checked his pulse. I knew it wasn't good.
Butch walked in and I asked him, "What are you doing home?" And I said, "Well, where is Trey?" And then he came in and he told me, he said, "There's been an accident." And I was thinking, you know, well, he's cut his foot or cut his hand or broke his arm, you know. And I said, "Well, that's okay. He'll be okay."
Trey was rushed by ambulance to Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas.
He was just laying there. He was breathing, or the machine was breathing for him. His little hands were still warm. And he just looked like he was asleep.
6 hours later, Trey died.
I just wanted to tell him that I was very, very proud of him. I loved him dearly.
My only son. My best friend. My fishing buddy. My hunting partner. Just a void.
Trey Cooley was seated in the club's designated safety area. It was an accident that shouldn't have happened. Detective Tom Pease and crime investigator David Taylor had a tough job to figure out where the bullet that killed Trey Cooley came from and to determine if the shooting was accidental or intentional. Butch Cooley spent 2 decades as a state trooper. Was it possible the shooting had something to do with an enemy he possibly made during his tenure? Or had the bullet come from outside, from one of the outdoor shooting ranges, or possibly the nearby railroad tracks where kids had a history of taking shots at the airgun building?
The biggest problem with this range, or this scene, was the size of it. It wasn't contained inside a house, inside an apartment. It was outside and it covered several hundred feet.
The bullet removed from Trey's skull would provide some answers and raise new questions. The bullet was small, about ½ an inch long, but lethal. Larry Fletcher is the firearms expert who conducted the ballistics examination.
The bullet was not that damaged. The bullet was in rather remarkable condition.
This is a .45 caliber bullet after striking a cement wall. It is badly mangled, especially when compared to the bullet that killed Trey Cooley. That lack of damage could be telling, except for one thing. This was not a typical .45 caliber bullet.
This particular bullet is a hand-loaded or hand-made bullet. It's not a commercial-made bullet, in which they can add other materials to the lead and make it much harder. It can withstand a lot of damage upon impact.
Who makes and uses these types of bullets? Butch Cooley knew.
Competitive shooters like to load their own ammunition. Primary reason being the cost savings.
Most of the competitive shooters on the outside ranges that day were using handmade bullets, so there was little doubt that the bullet came from somewhere here rather than from kids on the railroad tracks. Police collected the weapons and ammunition samples from the shooters in the competition. When Larry Fletcher examined the bullets used that day on the outside ranges, he noticed something else.
The powder charge, which increased the velocity of this particular type of bullet.
Basically, the shooters used bullets with more gunpowder. More gunpowder means these bullets travel farther and faster than a regular .45 caliber bullet. Fletcher's next task was to match the bullet that killed Trey to one of about a dozen guns. Each of the guns from the shooting competition were test-fired and compared to the bullet taken from Trey Cooley's skull. Fletcher had trouble getting an exact match because the extra gunpowder created extremely high temperatures during the firing of the gun, actually melting some of the distinguishing marks. But Fletcher noticed a red wax on the bullet that killed Trey. All shooters use a lubricating wax, but only one of the guns used a red wax. Larry Fletcher found the gun that fired the fatal shot.
At that point, I was pretty much convinced.
A pistol competitor named Dan Smith was using that gun on the day of the competition. And he was firing on this outdoor range, just behind the airgun building. But Smith told police he couldn't have fired the fatal shot.
He felt that all his shots had made the target, that there were no errant rounds.
But something just didn't add up to Butch Cooley. He spent his entire life around guns and won awards for marksmanship and gun safety. He knew shooting ranges are supposed to be safe. Accidents aren't supposed to happen. It just didn't make sense. Police were satisfied that Trey Cooley's death was an accident. The ballistics report said the fatal bullet came from a gun fired from an outdoor range during the competition. But how? The owner of the gun said he didn't miss a shot, and the range was designed to contain any errant bullet. First, there's a barrier between the airgun building and the firing range. It's called a berm. It's a small mountain of dirt about 12 feet high. The berm sits right behind the targets in the event a shooter misses either to the left or right. Directly above the targets are a series of wooden planks fastened end to end and side by side. These are called baffles and are designed to catch bullets fired a little high of the target before they leave the range. Then there are two additional sets of baffles, one just a few yards in front of the firing line and another called an eyebrow directly over the firing line. Ken Buster is a safety management consultant with years of experience as a shooter and with a special expertise in firing ranges.
Between the eyebrow, the baffles, and the height of the berm, the vast majority of any stray bullet would be stopped.
Safety should be the #1 priority in everybody's mind anytime that you participate in marksmanship as a sport. Something was wrong there.
Butch Cooley began a personal crusade to learn the truth. He needed to know how a bullet could bypass the range's safety features and kill his only son. Butch hired attorney Mike Schmidt to find out where or if the safety system had failed. Schmidt put together an investigative team. Steve Irwin was the first member. As an accident reconstructionist, his job was to create an exact, computerized, three-dimensional scale model of the airgun building and the firing ranges. Using laser technology, precision measuring devices, and sophisticated computer programs, Irwin would also uncover the path of the bullet.
You wind up starting at, unfortunately, the young boy getting shot and then working your way backwards.
Police had already identified some important clues. The outside wall of the airgun building was riddled with bullet holes from all angles. Irwin needed to know exactly which one was the culprit. Police also found bullet holes inside the building. in a sheetrock strip to protect a lighting fixture, and in a wall that separated the indoor range from a storage shed. There was also a fresh gouge in an ordinary ceiling tile. Irwin's laser survey equipment traced the bullet's path from where Trey was sitting through all those points, from Trey, through the sheetrock strip, off the ceiling tile, and through the back wall. It seemed unlikely, but it matched the evidence.
It was roughly a straight line, but I couldn't see from the interior wall to the exterior wall. And it wasn't until we got it back to the office and got it mapped that it formed this remarkably straight line.
A straight line that led directly to one of the bullet holes in the aluminum siding, then down to the shooting range behind the airgun building. It led to the range where Dan Smith was shooting, but oddly enough, not to the firing line. The laser pinpointed a path that landed 10 yards in front of the firing line. When Ken Buster was brought into the investigation, he immediately inspected the firing range to see if there was any way a bullet could get past all of the range's safety features. Buster delivered a scathing report.
At the time and now, I still think that was the worst range that I have ever seen.
He found dozens of potentially deadly safety flaws.
The berm separating the back range from the front range was not the standard height, which is supposed to be 20 feet.
The berm behind the airgun building was only 12 feet high. The baffles were far below standard. The wooden planks should have had a steel or concrete backing. And look closely at the planks themselves. They had separated, leaving big gaps. A bullet could easily pass through.
In this case, the baffle might well has not have been there and served no purpose at all.
And Buster was appalled by the bullet holes in the back of the building.
Several of these holes had been plugged. That means to me, as a safety person, as a range person, as a longtime shooter, that they knew that bullets were getting out of that range, and they accepted that fact and continued to shoot.
The laser analysis projected the bullet path to the middle of the outdoor range, well in front of the firing line. How could this be? It was due to a monumental blunder. During the competition, shooters were required to fire from several distances. First, from the firing line at 25 yards. Then they moved forward to 20 yards. And finally, to 15 yards. The laser study showed that the fatal bullet was fired from the 15-yard line. The architectural model shows the problem clearly. By firing from the 15-yard line, shooters had to move in front of the eyebrow and the first set of protective baffles. And Irwin's computer also showed another frightening reality. From the 15-yard line, you could see the back of the airgun building.
If you can see it, you can shoot it. And any projectile that might leave the range in that area was going to hit that building.
The laser showed the bullet flew under the last baffle, over the berm, and into the building. It involved a bizarre trajectory. It meant that the shooter missed the target high and to the left by more than 5 feet, a terrible miss. How could a trained marksman miss a target by that much from only 15 yards away? Part of that answer was found in the gun itself. Close examination revealed it had been modified.
It's like taking a standard car and making a hot rod.
Some competitive shooters file down parts of the gun to make it easier to pull the trigger quickly.
They've got it set to where they go off so easily when they fire 2 rounds instead of 1. It feeds so fast.
The result is called doubling, which sometimes occurs as the gun recoils. A recoil is the backward force created by the explosion pushing the gun up in the air. Each type of gun recoils differently.
A .45 creates a recoil up and to the left.
Kirk Parks had the task of producing the computerized proof, a fact-based animation of what happened. His firm specializes in forensic animation. Parks videotaped hundreds of .45 caliber pistol shots using the same type pistol and ammunition. He used this footage to create an exact, computerized reproduction of the recoil for the animation.
We shot the video from the top of the weapon, and we shot it from the side, and we shot it from the front.
Next, Parks created wireframe models of a competitive shooter in action, and then animated Irwin's laser studies of the firing range and the bullet path to complete the picture.
It produced the exact results necessary to generate the bullet path that was surveyed, up and to the left.
I can't say for sure that the gun doubled, but all of the evidence seems to indicate that it did, and it fired during the uncontrollable recoil.
This forensic animation was able to show what happened to Trey Cooley on the morning of September 29, 1991. But the animation showed that the bullet took a remarkable journey, one which almost defied belief. When Trey Cooley entered the Dallas Pistol and Revolver Club on September 29, 1991, the range was a tragedy just waiting to strike. Outside on the firing range behind the airgun building, Dan Smith, one of the last competitors of the day, steps up to the 15-yard line. This moves him in front of two sets of safety baffles. Using a modified gun, Smith takes aim and squeezes the trigger. In a fraction of a second, another shot is fired during the recoil phase of the original shot. It happens so quickly, the shooter doesn't know it left the gun. The bullet misses the target high and to the left. Traveling upwards, it passes underneath the last set of protective baffles and just 3 inches over the berm. It's speeding at 1,200 feet per second. The bullet blasts through the aluminum siding, goes through a storage room, misses a broom and some pipes by less than an inch, and then breaks through a second wall, entering the airgun range. Then, the bullet does something unbelievable. It strikes an ordinary ceiling tile, and for some unknown reason, it doesn't blast straight through into the roof. Instead, it skids along the tile for 7 inches before mysteriously changing direction, making a 10-degree turn, and begins a downward path. It slows to about 900 feet per second, penetrates a plaster wall, and enters Trey Cooley's head. The Cooley family filed a negligence suit against the gun club and individuals involved with the competition. The judge who presided over the civil case was impressed with the visual and computerized evidence.
I've been on the bench 6.5 years, and I would say that's in the top 2 or 3 or 4 in terms of just the professionalism and the effectiveness of the demonstrative evidence brought into court.
The Cooley's attorney says the forensic animation and model explained this tragedy in a way nothing else could.
I could not have possibly gotten the result that I got on behalf of the Cooley family without them.
The animation also helped Butch Cooley understand what had happened to his son. But there is still little peace for Trey's dad.
What's peace? You just take it a day at a time.
Change just one thing, and Trey Cooley might be alive today. The range.
It wouldn't have happened because I would not have allowed that competition to occur on that particular range.
The gun.
They may not even be aware that it's double firing or slam firing on them. They may think it's properly functioning.
The bullet.
If it had been a softer bullet, they may not have ricocheted as much, would not have had the velocity.
Or if the shooter had been standing at the proper firing line, the shot would have hit the baffle or flown over the building. But why did this fatal bullet change direction as it hit the soft ceiling tile instead of blasting straight through as it did with the hard walls?
Bullets can do incredible things they're not expected to do.
These thoughts haunt Butch Cooley. No explanation can ease the pain felt by a father who woke his son early one September morning.
Should have let him sleep.
On a hot summer evening in 1992, neighbors heard the familiar sound of an argument coming from the Campano residence. According to Christopher Campano, his wife left the house shortly after their argument to calm down. Karen Campano was never seen again. Karen Campano was just 2 weeks shy of her 43rd birthday when she disappeared. She had just come back to Oklahoma City after visiting her 3 children who were living in New York. Back to the home she shared with her 3rd husband, Chris.
She come back from New York and she went to talking about moving back because of her family and she's upset.
Chris and Karen Campano were married in December of 1987. Friends described them as an odd couple. She was 15 years older than Chris, and it was her 3rd marriage, his first. They were introduced to one another by Karen's best friend, who also happened to be Chris's mother. Chris was a drifter, worked construction jobs, and spent some time in jail for petty theft. Karen was the main wage earner, working as a bill collector for this credit adjustment company in town. On the evening of July 1st, 1992, Chris and Karen had one of their frequent arguments, this time over his use of drugs.
And I was into drugs, and she was, you know, nagging at me and trying to get me in drug programs and, you know, just trying to help.
It was loud enough for the neighbors to hear.
I could hear Karen screaming, and no, please, please, and don't do that. And couldn't make out a lot of what was being said, just a lot of screaming.
According to Chris, after the argument, Karen left the house for a walk, headed to the Buy for Less convenience store for some personal items a few blocks away. Chris left too, driving to a local bar for a few drinks, staying until about midnight. The next morning, Chris called Karen's office to see if she had reported to work. Her supervisor said she hadn't shown up or even called in. Chris then phoned the police to report her missing. When the police arrived to take Chris's statement, they looked around briefly and reported seeing no evidence of foul play or anything out of place or unusual.
If a person is going to run away or leave her husband, she's not just going to walk away and leave everything behind. She's going to take the things that mean the most to her, especially when you're dealing with a woman
things of, toiletries, makeup, and that kind of thing. And of course, we found all those things intact in the bedroom and in the bathroom, and it was as if she just disappeared off the face of the earth without taking anything with her.
While the police were there, Chris mentioned that the house had been burglarized the night before while he was out drinking and that some items were missing. Police asked Chris to sign a waiver to allow a search of the house.
And he agreed to do so and thought that would be good, and even commented that he hoped that we found something in the house that would help us with the investigation.
The first thing I recall seeing is the bed was against the south wall, and right next to the bed was a large white trash bag. And underneath that trash bag, I could see a very large brownish colored stain. Of course, the next thing we did was went and got some hemosticks, which we carried in our vehicle.
A hemostick is a chemical strip that can immediately tell whether or not blood is present.
Take the dry hemstick and with your finger just lightly smear it on the suspect stain to where some of it's transferred onto the hemstick. Take a drop of distilled water, put it on the hemstick, flick off the excess water, and you have a dark green, which is a positive presumptive test for the presence of blood.
The stain on the carpet was indeed blood. But was it human? And if so, whose was it?
The first day we were in the house, I put on a pair of gloves, and that spot on that carpet was still moist. This piece of carpet and the padding was completely soaked with blood. It was such a massive amount of blood that there was still actual moisture involved there. It was not completely dried.
The carpet was removed and delivered to the Oklahoma City Police Department's forensic chemistry lab.
I went on to do a octolony test. Is a species determination test to determine as to whether or not that blood came from a human or an animal source.
It was human blood.
That was enough to convince me that we weren't dealing with a routine missing persons case.
The police needed more to go on and felt the answers lay inside the Campano's house. When police discovered human blood inside the Campano's bedroom, they suspected the blood stain might belong to Karen Campano. They also suspected that Chris knew more about her disappearance than he was admitting.
She left at 7:30. What did you do then?
Under police questioning, Chris maintained that he knew nothing about his wife's whereabouts, but his alibi was weak. The bartender didn't recall seeing Chris Campano on the night of July 1st, and police discovered that Chris had pawned some of Karen's jewelry the morning after her disappearance. Without a body, the only thing left for the police to do was run more tests inside the house. There weren't any visible signs of violence besides the bloodstain they found in the bedroom.
We saw a typical little frame house for central Oklahoma City that, as you went inside, looked quite clean, quite neat. Things had been cleaned out of it. The walls looked clean, ceiling looked clean, the floor looked clean. So there wasn't much to see at all.
So they decided to look for blood which may have been cleaned up or wasn't visible to the naked eye. To do so, investigators used a special chemical solution called luminol, an extremely sensitive test which can detect blood which has been removed by water or even detergents and bleach.
Luminol is a fluorescence-type chemical. Spray it on a substance that may contain blood. It reacts with the heme group in the blood itself. The iron portions will luminesce or fluoresce.
To do the luminol test, investigators needed complete darkness, so they waited until nightfall. They began their chemical dragnet in the bedroom, where they discovered the stain on the carpet a few days earlier. First, they took photographs of the room, the way it looked to the naked eye. Then they sprayed the luminol. The results were astonishing.
There were some instances in that house where it glowed so brightly that you could actually see the person standing next to you. There was so much blood in there.
The luminol told a horrific tale. Blood had been everywhere. On the walls, the ceiling, on the doors.
It looked like a bloodbath had occurred there, something from a horror movie.
Even more telling was the blood spatter, which is the placement of the stains. Where they were located, the size of the drops and the trails of blood all told a story. Someone had been beaten in the bedroom with a blunt object.
They were in 2 trails, what we refer to as cast-off trails. So if you had an object, for example, in your hand, and that object was blood-covered, and if you were swinging that object overhead, the centrifugal force of pulling the blood down to the end of the object will cast the blood in the direction the object is being swung. And in this case, it's going to the ceiling. There are 2 distinct trails, and you can tell that there's at least 2 swings with the blood-covered object.
Luminol was then applied to the rest of the house and even to the outside steps and walkways.
At one point, there's a swipe of blood that was on the kitchen door leading into the utility room that would have been about head level if you were carrying a body and had to turn the body sideways to get it through a normal door. And then at that point, it appeared the body was laid down on the ground and then drug from the utility room down the back steps.
And you could see pooled luminescence on each step, and then drag marks that were luminescent all the way down the walkway until you got to the point that you were at the driveway, and at that point they disappeared. Very, very dramatic presentation.
The house was telling its story, one of an apparently gruesome attack. But there were still unanswered questions. Where was the body? And the weapon? And was the blood Karen Campano's? Police still couldn't prove a murder had been committed. Although the police knew someone was violently attacked inside the Campano residence, they couldn't be sure a homicide had been committed. Was there enough blood in the Campano house to prove that someone was dead? And was that someone Karen Campano?
The investigators at a later time decided that we'd go back and try to do a measurement test to see how much blood had to have been let out on that carpet to make that size of a stain.
Police made sure their test was as accurate as possible. They used a piece of the original carpet as well as a weight to simulate a human head. Next, they poured human blood around the weight until they created a stain measuring 887 square inches, the same size stain they originally discovered.
Statistically, one could say that between 1,300 and 1,400 cc's of blood would create that stain.
That's more than 40% of the blood volume of a woman Karen Campano's size. No one could survive with that amount of blood loss.
So at that point, it became pretty apparent to me that if this lady was missing and if this lady was dead, that this lady probably was killed right there.
The authorities now knew a homicide had been committed in the house and that someone had died in the bedroom in a pool of blood. But was the victim Karen Campano? Police didn't have a sample of Karen Campano's blood to compare to the blood stain. If Karen's mother and father were still living, it would have been a simple matter to examine their DNA, since Karen would have received half of her DNA from her mother and half from her father, but Karen's father was deceased. The Oklahoma City Police Department asked the FBI to get involved to see if there was any way they could figure out whether the blood found in the house belonged to Karen Campano. The police obtained blood samples from Karen's mother, her 2 sisters, her 3 children, and one of her ex-husbands.
And so in this particular case, the object of the examination was to see if this DNA from the bloodstain of unknown origin was matching. At least half of the DNA was matching to the relatives from Karen Campano.
Hal Dedman of the FBI's DNA analysis unit conducted what is called RFLP analysis, analyzing pieces of DNA from 4 different chromosomes. This is the DNA profile of Karen Campano's mother. And next to it, on either side, are 2 of her daughters, Karen Campano's sisters. Both daughters share half of their DNA with their mother. This lane shows a DNA sample from one of Karen Campano's ex-husbands. The next lane shows a sample from his son, whose mother was Karen Campano. The father and son both share the upper band. The son would have received the lower band from his mother, which matches the band from his grandmother, Karen's mother. The next autorad compares the family member's DNA to the unknown blood stain found in the Campano home. The top marker matches the genetic profile from the first of Karen Campano's children, and the markers from the blood stain also matched the bands from Karen Campano's 2 other children from another marriage.
Results were fairly straightforward. They were totally consistent with the blood coming from Karen Campano.
8 months after the disappearance of Karen Campano, police concluded that Christopher Campano murdered his wife and was arrested. All of the evidence pointed towards Chris Campano. The forensic evidence, the argument neighbors heard on the night of Karen's disappearance, Chris's lack of an alibi for the entire evening, and the fact that he pawned some of her things. The prosecution believed that Karen Campano never left her house for a walk, as her husband had suggested. Neighbors heard Karen and Chris arguing that night, and the forensic evidence suggests that the argument moved to their bedroom, where it escalated and turned violent. As Chris stood near the window, he struck Karen in the head with a blunt object, at least 3 times, possibly more, producing the cast-off blood trails on the ceiling and walls. Karen fell to the floor, her head striking the bedpost where her blood was also found. As Karen lay bleeding from her massive head injuries, Chris left and went to a local bar. He needed to wait until the neighbors were asleep before removing Karen's body. When he returned home, he wrapped Karen's body in a sheet with a telephone wire and carried her through the house. Luminol tests showed that Karen's head brushed against the door, leaving a blood smear, later cleaned with detergent. Chris then dropped the body onto the floor and dragged it through the side door and out towards the car. He probably disposed of her body late that night in a deserted location. After returning home, Chris removed all visible traces of blood both inside and out. The DNA analysis showed the blood found on the carpet belonged to Karen Campano. And the medical examiner would testify that Karen Campano suffered horrendous head injuries during the attack which no one could survive. Prosecutors were confident of a conviction even though they didn't have a body or a murder weapon.
Well, I thought it was very likely we might never find the body of the victim.
But just as the preliminary hearing was set to get underway, everything changed. The police found Karen Campano.
This part right here wasn't quite so grown up with all this ivy, and she was laying right down there by that large cottonwood tree, north to south, and there were some blankets around her. There was no greenery at that time. If there had been greenery at that time, you'd never know she was there.
The body lay in a remote area off a major interstate highway until some youngsters on dirt bikes stumbled across it.
All we knew was that we had a female's body out there. We had no idea who it was. Of course, we were hoping it was Karen, but we didn't know.
There was another important find. Police discovered a piece of a check underneath the body. Although they couldn't determine to whom the check was issued, it was from the Shell Oil Company and mailed to someone in New York. The check was for $83.34. Karen Campano was from New York, and her family had a part interest in a gas station there.
This was the first definitive piece that we had, that we knew at that point there was a great possibility that it was Karen. And of course, we wouldn't know for sure until they made identification through dental records and DNA.
Dr. Tom Glass heads the Forensic Odontology Department at the University of Oklahoma. With the help of Karen Campano's dental records and an almost complete set of teeth found in the skull of the body, Dr. Glass's task was fairly easy.
What I do in making the comparison then is simply go frame by frame by frame of the patient's ante-mortem dental x-rays, the x-rays made by the dentist, with the frames of the same areas made on the skeletonized remains. She had a very thorough dentist who documented what he had done. And that documentation allowed the identification in Karen Campano's case to be very profound.
And a DNA analysis of the bone marrow confirmed it. The last doubts had been removed.
Personally, I'm glad she was eventually found because of the family back in New York. I talked to them at length over the phone. Later on during the investigation, I met them. They're really great people, and I really had strong feelings for them, hoping one day she would be found so they could put their own fears to rest and give her a decent burial.
And Christopher Campano confessed. The remarkable thing about it, the autopsy confirmed the prosecution's theory of how Karen died. And that theory, remember, was based only on the luminol, the blood spatter analysis, and the blood volume tests.
The maxilla were fractured, the mandibles were fractured, the nose was fractured, the sinuses were fractured, the skull was extensively fractured, yet the cervical spine was intact, and there were only 3 fractures in the ribs. So this is not the hallmark of somebody that's been run over by a car, or somebody who's had a train wreck, or something like that. This is the hallmark of someone who has sustained a severe beating about the head and face. So it was obvious that this was an assault.
Police and forensic science had solved a difficult puzzle.
It all told a story. It was just more of the pieces of the puzzle coming together, even all the way to the end when the body was actually found. It's like, you know, we've got most of the puzzle there. You know what it is. Even with some missing pieces, you know what it is. But then with that body found, it was like that was the very last piece that just fit in there.
In January of 1994, a year and a half after Karen was killed, Christopher Campano went on trial for his life. His defense attorney couldn't refute the forensic findings. They were just too strong.
Once I had decided to make that leap and embrace the evidence, then my task became easier. It was a matter then of looking at the psychological aspects of the case rather than the hard forensics of the case. I suggested to the judge and jury if it was going to be deliberately planned out and methodical, that kind of blood wouldn't be there. There would be none in the house probably. The homicide would have occurred elsewhere if it had been a cold-blooded killing.
The jury bought at least part of the argument. It found Campano guilty of manslaughter, not the first-degree murder charge the state was seeking.
I feel sorry for it. I feel sorry for what I did to her. Can't bring her back, you know. I just got to pay for what I've done.
Christopher Campano was sentenced to 1,000 years in prison. Early one morning, in a deserted area outside of Phoenix, a motorcyclist discovered the body of a young woman. She had been beaten, bound, strangled, and possibly raped. The surrounding plants would tell more about her killer than any other single piece of evidence. When investigators from the sheriff's department arrived at the crime scene, they gathered every possible piece of evidence. The victim was nude except for a pulled-up tank top and a t-shirt wrapped around her neck, which was probably used to strangle her. Her wrists and ankles were loosely bound with shoelaces and what looked like picture-hanging wire. Nearby, investigators found a syringe, some articles of clothing. Then they heard some evidence. It was a pager, found deep in the grass a few feet from the body. The discovery of the pager triggered a larger search, and the photographer took some aerial photographs. There appeared to be a circular area of matted grass where an altercation possibly took place. Police took the victim's remains to the medical examiner for identification and autopsy. A fingerprint search identified the victim as 30-year-old Denise Johnson, a single mother of 2 young children. She was born and raised in an area of Phoenix known as the Projects.
She wasn't a bad girl. Some of her friends, I think she got with the wrong friends. I ain't gonna say they made her do these things now.
She hung around with people that liked to party, drink, and I don't really know what they were doing, but she, you know, she was out there in the world with people that did drugs, I'm sure, and sometimes I think she trusted too much.
Denise made her living on the streets of Phoenix. She had a history of shortchanging truck drivers in various drug deals at local truck stops, which earned her the nickname Twist Mama.
Her friends cautioned her that her lifestyle was probably going to find her in a lot of trouble someday, and eventually it did.
But who ended Denise Johnson's life? The investigation began with the pager found lying near the body. It belonged to this man, a local trucker named Mark Bogan. He said that on his way home from work the night before, he stopped to make a phone call. That's when he met Denise Johnson for the first time.
Hi, how you doing?
Hello there.
Bogan said she asked for a ride to the interstate.
Why not?
Thanks.
Once inside the truck, she made some sexual advances. They pulled off the road and had consensual sex in the cab of his truck. Afterwards, as he was dropping her off, he said she attempted to steal some of his things off the dashboard.
Oh, I had a really good time.
So did I, baby.
Did you?
Oh, always when I'm in the company of a lovely lady. I would really love to have my wallet back.
After a brief scuffle, he retrieved his wallet. She got out and left on foot. Bogan said that was the last he saw of her. The next morning, he noticed his pager was missing, assumed he had lost it, and called the pager company to report it missing. During the interrogation of Mark Bogan, investigators noticed scratch marks on the side of his face.
If there were scratches on the suspect's face, then you would expect that if those were in fact inflicted by fingers or fingernails of the victim, there should be some residue of either the skin cells and or maybe even blood under the fingernails.
The autopsy of Denise Johnson revealed no skin or blood under any of her fingernails. The medical examiner found that Denise Johnson's death was caused by asphyxiation due to strangulation. Blood tests showed cocaine in her system. However, there were no signs of any type of sexual activity. There was no semen found, no foreign hair, clothing fibers, or saliva found anywhere on her body. The autopsy told investigators how Denise Johnson died, but provided no clues about her killer. Their one suspect, Mark Bogan, was apparently a dead end. The sheriff's office had not only a murder, but a mystery. On the day after police discovered Denise Johnson's body, Homicide Detective Charlie Norton was assigned to the case.
I decided that it would help me as the investigator to go out and familiarize myself with the scene where the body was found.
Denise Johnson's body was discovered in a remote part of Maricopa County, about a half an hour away from downtown Phoenix. Charlie Norton was looking for anything out of place or unusual, anything that might have been overlooked the day before. Then he saw it, something peculiar on a Palo Verde tree, just a few feet from where the body was found.
I had parked my car on the pavement. I noticed that there was a branch that was hanging over, and when I looked at that branch, I noticed that there was a fresh abrasion, and I had no idea what it might mean, but I took a picture of it. Then I took some beans off of that particular tree.
Meanwhile, investigators confiscated Mark Bogan's truck to look for possible evidence linking him or his truck to the crime scene. It was completely clean. No fingerprints, semen, blood, saliva, hair, or clothing fibers. No evidence at all that Denise Johnson was even in the truck. But when investigators and police photographers looked in the back of the truck, they made an interesting discovery. They found 2 bean pods from a Palo Verde tree. Was it possible that Bogan's truck brushed against the Palo Verde tree at the crime scene, causing 2 bean pods to drop into the back of the truck? The problem was, Palo Verde trees are very common in Arizona. There are tens of thousands of them in the Phoenix area alone. But Charlie Norton's boss had an idea: to see if DNA testing could match the bean pods from Bogan's truck to the tree with the abrasion at the crime scene.
I suggested to Charlie at the time, I said, you know, it'd be a real good idea if we could find someone, somewhere in the United States that is involved in DNA testing of plant life. You know, I said, what the hell have we got to lose? You know, where are we going to go from here?
What's the number for ID?
Norton started working the phones, calling scientists all over the United States.
I've got answers like it couldn't be done to maybe it could be done, and that if it could be done, that the cost would be prohibitive.
15 telephone calls later, he found someone who offered some hope, ironically, just 100 miles away, at the University of Arizona in Tucson.
I saw that as sort of a public service thing that we could do, that we'd show some of this science is relevant to people in maybe a way that's not quite as obvious sometimes through agriculture.
Could DNA really show that one plant or tree was different from another, even though they were the same species? DNA is present in all cells of all living things. It's a little like a computer program containing all of the information necessary to create a living thing. All humans have different DNA profiles except for identical twins. In the early 1980s, Dr. Alec Jeffreys, a British scientist, discovered a test that made it possible to identify an individual's DNA profile. Jeffreys' breakthrough technique was first used in a criminal case in 1986. But plant DNA had never been used in a criminal case, and scientists weren't even sure they could figure out a way to extract DNA from the Palo Verde seed pods.
Well, we certainly use fingerprinting a lot in agriculture, but we'd never looked at this particular species, this tree. Nobody has probably ever done much biology on it at all.
Prosecutors had circumstantial evidence linking Mark Bogan to Denise Johnson's murder, but they needed something more definitive. They knew they would have to prove that Bogan was at the crime scene, and the Palo Verde pods were their best chance. The scientists had no idea that their research would be the cornerstone of a murder case. The Arizona Sheriff's Department wanted to know if there was any way scientists could match the 2 seed pods found in the back of Mark Bogan's truck to the Palo Verde tree next to where they discovered Denise Johnson's body. But there were thousands of Palo Verde trees in the Phoenix area alone, and there had never been a DNA test on this type of tree.
We had to learn how to do the analysis so that we could say, do trees look different from each other in this species? Because what we wanted to know was, not was this a Palo Verde tree, but could I match it to that specific tree?
Dr. Helen Jarvis used what is known as a randomly amplified polymorphic DNA technique, or RAPID. This is a less common test than RFLP, the one used in searches for human DNA.
One of the great things about RAPIDs is that you're able to know nothing about an individual species or type of organism. You don't have to have any prior knowledge about it. All you have to do is get DNA, and the method works.
The test begins by removing the beans from their hard outer shell or pod.
Seeds have DNA both from the mother tree and other trees that would have pollinated it, so we need to get rid of those and just use the pod material, which will only have DNA from the mother tree.
The shells are put into liquid nitrogen, making them brittle and easier to grind into a fine powder. A chemical solution is added and the DNA floats free, a sticky bundle of complex molecules. The sample amount of DNA from a seed pod is too small for analysis, so scientists increase the sample size by copying the DNA strand. They use a technique called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. The copying process takes place in a DNA thermal cycler. Within a few hours, this technique multiplies the DNA millions of times. The DNA is then placed into various lanes of a gel with a dye added, and then subjected to an electrical field. Under ultraviolet light, it's possible to see how the electrical current draws the negatively charged fragments through the gel to the positive end at the top. The results resemble a barcode, the genetic fingerprint of a Palo Verde tree. These fingerprints enabled Helen Jarvis to make an important discovery. The two pods found in Mark Bogan's truck matched each other. And they also matched the pods taken from the tree at the crime scene, the tree next to where Denise Johnson's body was discovered. Every other Palo Verde tree tested had a completely different DNA profile. It was the result that investigators and the district attorney had hoped for.
It wasn't the criminal itself, but it was a particular tree that we had to identify, and in fact we had matched that up.
He was able to take the original samples, take a part of the samples from the pickup truck, determined that those two pods came from the very same tree. Then he compared those with samples from all 12 trees and matched it to a tree there at the crime scene, not knowing that the tree had the scrape on it to which he matched it.
But there were only 12 trees in the initial test, and the prosecution felt that wasn't a large enough sample. They needed to show a potential judge and jury that all of the Palo Verde trees in Arizona had a different DNA profile. So the district attorney sent Helen Jarvis pods from 100 different trees, asking him to prove that each had a separate and distinct DNA profile. And he tried to trick Helen Jarvis.
I did not tell Dr. Helen Jarvis that I had gone back out to the scene, had a deputy take a sample from the same tree, which had the scrape on it.
Dr. Helen Jarvis proved that each of the pods had a different DNA profile, and he also discovered the prosecution's trick.
I called him and I was a little concerned because, well, we could tell all these trees apart and so forth, but we put the sample back in and it looked like it matched one of these supposedly random trees that they'd gone out and done.
It's almost like a touchdown in the end zone. I knew it. I knew he had hit on it. Out of 20 other samples that he had tested on one gel, he hit and matched perfectly.
Police arrested Mark Bogan and charged him for the murder of Denise Johnson. He entered a plea of not guilty. But the question remained, would this new DNA evidence be admissible in court? No one had ever introduced plant DNA as evidence in a criminal trial anywhere.
We held a preliminary hearing before the judge only to review the scientific evidence to see whether or not it was evidence that was generally accepted in the scientific community as both valid and reliable.
For 3 days, without a jury on hand, lawyers and scientists argued whether plant DNA should be admitted into a criminal trial for the first time ever.
What all of the scientists agreed about was that plant DNA, like human DNA, was unique to each plant, and if properly tested, could distinguish one Palo Verde tree from another Palo Verde tree, and there seemed to be no dispute about that.
Judge Bolton denied the defense motion to prohibit Dr. Helen Jarris's testimony, thereby allowing the DNA evidence to be admitted at the trial. In setting a precedent, Judge Bolton had made DNA history.
We were the first criminal case in the country that used a DNA comparison of plant material to as a piece of evidence.
Now, armed with the potent weapon of a DNA fingerprint, the prosecution went to trial, attempting to prove to a jury that Mark Bogan murdered Denise Johnson. What happened to Denise Johnson on the night of May 2nd, 1992? The prosecution believed that Mark Bogan met Denise Johnson at a phone booth.
Hi, how you doing?
They spoke briefly, and Denise asked for a ride.
Sure, why not?
Thanks.
They drove to a deserted location for what was going to be a consensual sexual encounter.
How would you like to have some real fun?
Bogan asked Denise if she would agree to some light bondage and tied her wrists and ankles with some picture frame wire and shoelaces. Some of Bogan's ex-girlfriends would testify that he enjoyed bondage, and another witness told investigators that she saw the same type of wire in the cab of his truck just a few days earlier.
No! No, stop it! No.
At some point, Denise Johnson objected to what was happening and asked Bogan to stop. Johnson got out of the truck and tried to run, with Bogan fast behind. Quickly, the situation turned violent. The two struggled in the open field. Bogan lost the pager he carried on his waist, which fell into the high grass. Bogan strangled Johnson with her own T-shirt. Then he dragged her body under some nearby bushes and left. As Bogan drove away, his truck brushed against a Palo Verde tree, leaving the abrasion. 2 seed pods dropped into the back of his truck. An eyewitness saw a white truck similar to the one Bogan owned coming out of the road leading from the crime scene, going through a stop sign and speeding off in the direction of Phoenix. The witness said it was about 1:30 in the morning. Bogan lived 18 minutes from the area, and his wife told police she awoke as Mark returned home just after 2 in the morning. Most of the evidence against Mark Bogan was circumstantial. The lost beeper, the picture frame wire, his interest in bondage, and the witness who saw a white truck in the vicinity of the crime scene the night of the murder. But the most critical evidence in the case was the plant DNA.
There wasn't a fingerprint, there wasn't a drop of blood, there wasn't a hair. There were none of those things that anybody could say were part of the victim's body found, must have been left by the victim on the defendant or on the defendant's property, or vice versa.
He had admitted to the detectives that he'd washed his truck the next morning. He got rid of all of the evidence in the truck except for 2 Palo Verde pods.
They needed evidence that placed Mark at the scene because he did have a credible story.
As a prosecutor, I had a mantle of evidence that I wanted to place upon the shoulders of the defendant. The Palo Verde pods took the mantle by the drawstring and wrapped it around his neck.
Unable to challenge Dr. Helen Jarris's findings themselves, the defense challenged the evidence, implying the pods were planted in the back of Mark's truck. But investigators said the seed pods were found in Bogan's truck before samples were taken from the crime scene.
If I was going to plant evidence, I would plant something that I know that I could match later on and probably be a little bit more assured of a conviction.
The jury found Mark Bogan guilty of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole for at least 25 years. The appellate court upheld the verdict. Mark Bogan continues to maintain his innocence, and the appeal process is continuing.
I'm trying to forget this case because I'm the only person on the planet that lost to a plant.
It was something that hadn't been done before, something that was certainly very different from the routine things that we do every day as judges.
But I love my daughter very much. I love all my children. But it's something we just have to go through. It's done. I don't know what in the world that could have tripped him off to hurt her like that. I don't know. But I hope one day we'll find out.
Shortly after Thanksgiving in 1987, an intruder broke into the Tucker residence in Arlington, Virginia. It might have been just another statistic, but the crime committed that night launched a new era in police investigations. This is how DNA evidence and psychological profiling helped catch a serial killer and set an innocent man free.
Everything about her was very gentle. She was very soft-spoken. Just had this amazing softness about her, this human quality.
44-year-old Susan Tucker was a publications editor who worked for the United States Forestry Service. She was spending the Thanksgiving holiday alone since her husband Reggie was out of the country in Wales on a business trip.
Neither of us could put the phone down. We kept saying, "I love you." And we said this over and over again. I don't know how many times.
But without explanation, telephone calls went unanswered. And neighbors noticed her bedroom window wide open in the cold November weather, so they called police. As they approached the front door, they noticed it was ajar. Inside, a woman's purse was lying on the foyer floor.
I arranged a call on the Monday. Couldn't get an answer, just rang.
Tucker.
I rang again. I rang again. I don't know how many times I rang.
Susan Tucker's badly decomposed body was lying face down on the bed. She had been dead for 4 or 5 days.
Her hands were tied behind her back, her feet were tied, the head hanging over the side of the bed almost.
She had been strangled and possibly raped.
It appeared that the killer more than likely was inside the home for quite some time. I mean, it wasn't just a very, quick in and out type of a situation. Many of the drawers had been, ransacked, had been gone through.
When Reggie Tucker first heard the news, He was devastated.
She said, "Sir, I've got bad news." And I knew it. I just knew it at that point. I just, you know, my whole world just fell away.
Detective Joe Horgus of the Arlington Police Homicide Unit was quickly assigned to the case. His task wouldn't be easy. For one thing, the killer had been careful. He had worn gloves and left no fingerprints.
Yeah, this has been wiped clean.
It had been raining on the night of the murder, and he meticulously cleaned the area around his point of entry.
He's smart enough to know that footprints, which is what we would have gotten from that, would maybe come back to haunt him, which kind of tells you maybe some past experience on burglaries.
Police collected the sheets, nightgown, and the large sleeping bag which covered Susan Tucker's body to look for possible blood and semen stains. They found hairs on the bedding around Susan Tucker's body, in the bathroom sink, and on a washcloth discovered outside on the clothesline. And they gathered shards of broken glass from the basement window. Everything was taken to the forensics lab for analysis, but perhaps the most important clue was also the most obvious: the rope and knots used to strangle Susan Tucker. The police were convinced they had seen this killer's work before. 3 years earlier, a 34-year-old lawyer named Carolyn Hom had been raped and strangled in her home only 4 blocks away from Susan Tucker. The killer entered the Hom residence the same way, through a basement window, and tied his victim using the same knots.
And it's not a common occurrence, not common at all, to see victims killed by using ligatures to strangle them, ropes tying up victims. It's really quite rare.
But the Hom case was closed when this man, David Vasquez, confessed to her murder and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Could he have had an accomplice? Horgus spoke to him for several hours.
And from the way he was talking and everything and answering my questions, I didn't think he knew a damn thing about Carolyn Hom's murder.
While Detective Horgus began his search for Susan Tucker's killer, 100 miles away in the capital city of Richmond, police there were investigating a series of murders shockingly similar.
The body of 35-year-old Debbie Davis was found inside her South Richmond apartment. She'd been raped and strangled.
In less than a month, 2 young women had been raped and strangled in their homes just a few blocks from each other.
In each case, there was a forced entry, with the murderer entering by cutting the screens and entering through an open window. Each victim was strangled. Both victims were white, between the ages of 30 and 35 years.
2 weeks later, he struck again, this time a 15-year-old girl raped and strangled in her bedroom while her family was sleeping. All 3 had been bound, raped, and strangled with rope. The knots were identical to the ones used in the Arlington cases. Detective Horgus suspected that the killer of Susan Tucker was the same man who murdered Carolyn Hom and the 3 women in Richmond. If Horgus was correct, a serial murderer was loose on a 100-mile killing spree. Detective Horgus believed the man who raped and strangled Susan Tucker had also murdered Carolyn Hom 3 years earlier. Horgus also believed the same man was responsible for the 3 rapes and murders in Richmond, 100 miles away. The Richmond police weren't so sure.
I mean, they have 3 murders that were within a couple miles square radius, I'm guessing, or maybe even less, that, you know, and now we're trying to say that 100 miles away, we're trying to link something to theirs. It's like, yeah, get out of here. I mean, this is a local guy.
Horgus was a man, he was the perfect man for this case because he was obsessed. He knew something was wrong.
Author Paul Moniz wrote a best-selling book entitled Stalking Justice. It profiles the rapes and murders of these 5 women and the history-making investigation which followed.
Joe Horgus is motivated by the hunt. He's not a guy who's obsessed by issues of right and wrong, except for his own internal moral compass, which tells him if there's an innocent man in prison, I don't care if we got the guilty guy, we got to get the innocent man out. And he was determined to get this guy.
But if Horgus was right, that all of these murders were connected, he needed proof. For that, he turned to the forensics lab, where scientists were examining the stains found on Susan Tucker's nightgown and bedding.
I found 4 semen stains, and when I analyzed the sleeping bag, I found one very large semen stain. I typed all of those stains.
The semen came from an individual with type O blood and a PGM1 enzyme profile. Although this matched 13% of the population, it also matched the semen found at the Carolyn Hamm murder scene. Next, they turned their attention to the hair found at the Tucker crime scene.
And there are characteristics, microscopically, that can classify hair into one of 3 racial categories,
which are Caucasian, Negroid, or Mongoloid. The hairs found at the Tucker crime scene appeared to be pubic and did not appear to be from the victim or her husband. They were positively identified as Negroid in origin. This was another possible link to the Carolyn Hamm murder case. 3 years earlier, at the time of Hamm's murder, a black male wearing a mask had raped a number of women in the same neighborhood. The masked rapist was never apprehended, and Horgus always suspected that there was a connection to the Hamm murder.
Actually, the same day that Carolyn Hamm's body was found, another girl, lady, was in her house, and this black male with a mask and a knife burglarized her house, got her, and actually he did some sexual activity with her.
The Richmond police and later the Arlington police both sought help from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia. This unit has interviewed hundreds of serial killers to learn what similarities exist in their psychological makeup. They were able to predict a number of important things about the killer.
We get in and look at the behavior that's left by the offender in the commission of his crime. We believe that by looking at that behavior, we can interpret the type of offender that may have committed the crime.
The fact that the strangler attacked his victims in their homes suggested that he had stalked them first and knew precisely when to strike. The FBI concluded that the perpetrator was between the age of 18 and 30, the quiet type, a loner who held a menial job. He probably had a troubled relationship with his mother and began his crime spree with arson. Historically, many serial rapists and murderers begin with arson. Serial killers are usually white, but could be any race. He lived or worked close to where he committed his first crimes. That's because criminals begin their crime sprees in an area where they feel most comfortable. He took sadistic pleasure in strangling his victims. He would periodically release the bindings so he could hear his victim plead for her life.
It appeared that the perpetrator had intended the victim to suffer considerably. In one case, a shoe impression was found on the victim's back.
These women were obviously first just terrified to the very bone, and then were systematically sexually assaulted, and you know, at the end, and it's not clear whether they were dead when he did this or alive, but he also masturbated on his victims.
And it was these semen samples which would prove to be extremely important pieces of evidence.
I can remember our prosecutor, Helen Fahey, a couple of days after the murder, asking me if this was going to be a DNA case. And I'm kind of, I don't know. I mean, we don't even know what we had got yet.
In 1987, when Susan Tucker was murdered, DNA evidence was still in its infancy. The first time DNA evidence was used in a criminal case was only a year earlier in England, when DNA from a semen sample was used to convict a bakery worker with the rape and murder of two 15-year-old girls. Horgus decided to try this new DNA testing, sending the semen stains from Susan Tucker's nightgown to the Life Codes laboratory in New York. Forensic scientists were concerned that the samples may have degraded or been contaminated.
You basically isolate the DNA, you cut it up, you generate profiles or patterns, and you then generate these patterns on a piece of X-ray film. So it's like a picture of the DNA. And when you then compare these pictures, and the components are the same in the two DNAs, that would indicate that they're from the same source.
The final results from the DNA tests would take up to 10 weeks, but Detective Horgus still didn't have a suspect. Detective Horgus suspected that the same individual who raped and murdered Susan Tucker and Carolyn Hahn 3 years earlier was the masked rapist who was committing crimes in the same area but was never caught. So Horgus drove out to an area of Arlington known as Green Valley, the area where the masked rapist committed his first assaults. The FBI told Horgus that rapists usually commit their first crime close to home.
If the first rape was the first rape for this guy, then he would have lived around there, and that was very crucial to me because I didn't know that.
And as he drove through Green Valley, Horgus tried to recall the names or faces of likely suspects, young men he'd run across over the years who came from that area.
And it just so happens that Detective Horgus started to focus on this one juvenile he had dealt with or remembered him. He just couldn't place the name.
And all I could remember was Timmy. I could see his face. I remembered the approximate time period and everything that I remembered him from, but I couldn't remember his last name.
So we were running all these names through the computer, seeing when they'd been locked up and released. And suddenly he just came in and he said, Spencer, Timothy Spencer, that's the name.
And I saw where he was arrested on January the 29th, 1984, which was 4 days after Carolyn Hahn, her body was found.
Spencer's history unfolded. In trouble as a teenager, he had a string of burglary convictions, and even more surprising, just as the FBI predicted, Spencer had first drawn police attention for arson, for setting fire to his mother's car.
He was presently in a halfway house in Richmond. Well, wow, that's exciting now.
Spencer was on probation, living in this halfway house just a short distance from where the Richmond murders took place. And according to house records, Spencer had been signed out during the Thanksgiving holiday, visiting his mother in Arlington, the week Susan Tucker was murdered.
The fact that he got out of prison 2 weeks before the first murders down in Richmond, the fact that he was available for every murder, the fact that he came to Arlington when he did for our murder.
And the FBI was correct about another important detail. Spencer lived in the area where the first rape was committed.
And that happened over there. And at the time, Timothy Spencer was living down here over this hill.
In his mother's house, barely a mile from the homes of Carolyn Hahn and Susan Tucker. On January 20th, 1988, police arrested Timothy Spencer. Within hours, they had collected a blood sample, some of his hair, and confiscated his clothing for forensic analysis.
The clothing was scraped down for removing any debris, and once that debris was collected, it was taken to a microscope. Several dozen particles of glass were removed from the debris that was removed from his clothing.
The glass fragments were of particular interest to the police. After police recovered glass particles from Spencer's clothing, they were examined forensically to see if they matched glass from any of the victims' homes. One technique is called glass refraction analysis. By shining light from different points on the spectrum through the particles, the characteristics of the glass can be plotted on a graph, in effect measuring how the particles bend light.
If you stick the pen into the water, which is more dense than the air, it bends the light. What we're doing with the glass particle basically is measuring how much the light is bent in a and we call it refractive index.
They compared the glass fragments found on Spencer's clothing to the glass particles taken from the broken window at Susan Tucker's home.
We were able to say that that glass that was removed from Spencer's clothing either came from that particular pane or that particular source of glass or another source of glass that had the same optical characteristics.
When scientists completed the DNA analysis of the semen stain found at the Susan Tucker crime scene, they made a chilling discovery.
And I remember pulling out an X-ray film from the developer and holding it up from these two separate cases and being bombarded immediately that the patterns I'm seeing are the same. I'm seeing the same profile on this case from one county versus this case from a second county, which says to me that the same person is involved in both of those incidents. It really gave you chills up and down your spine to see something like that.
Horgus was right all along. The semen sample from the individual who raped and presumably murdered Susan Tucker matched the semen stains from the murders in Richmond.
There were 7 hairs that were consistent with his. There was a glass fragment that was consistent with his. His family couldn't provide him with a complete alibi for the entire weekend.
And finally, Timothy Spencer's blood DNA was compared to the semen samples from the crime victims.
Once we got a sample from Mr. Spencer to test, we generated a profile that was the same as the profile we got from the evidentiary samples. We had a frequency of occurrence of greater than 1 in a million. So that means that only one person in a million in the population would have that particular genetic profile.
And starting with the first result, the blood type, it was a match, it was a match, it was a match, it was a match.
On July 11th, 1988, Timothy Spencer went on trial for his life. It was the first time in the United States where DNA evidence would be used in a serial murder case. It took the jury less than 7 hours to find Timothy Spencer guilty of rape and capital murder. He was sentenced to death.
I feel some kind of relief, but I'll never have my wife back. That's really the bottom line, is I'll never really feel happy. I can't feel happy about somebody being guilty of raping and murdering my wife. I can't feel happy about that. So whatever anger I feel, I will feel till I die.
Death was pronounced by the attending physician at 11:13 p.m. There were no complications. Mr. Spencer did not make a last statement. Thank you.
Up until his death, I don't think that Timothy Spencer made the connection between semen and blood. I don't think he knew that the same DNA that's in your semen is in your blood.
Without DNA, it would have been impossible to convict Timothy Spencer. If he had committed those murders a year or 2 years earlier, he could not have been convicted. In fact, if this had been 1984 or 1985, we probably would not even have arrested him.
Some people ask the question, will DNA fingerprinting replace detective work? I don't think so. Susan Tucker left Detective Horgus the crime scene, and Timothy Spencer left part of himself at the crime scene. But his name would never have come up if it wasn't for Detective Horgus.
As America celebrated its 200th birthday as an independent nation, Its birthplace, Philadelphia, played host to millions of tourists and hundreds of business gatherings. Philadelphia made history that summer, but not for the bicentennial. It was the mysterious death of 34 people that left a tragic legacy and launched the most extensive medical investigation in history. The summer of 1976 was a busy time for the city of Philadelphia, filled with bicentennial celebrations, tourist activities, and business conventions. It should have been a time of celebration for city officials as well, but they faced a number of unexpected difficulties. Sanitation workers staged a work slowdown over a wage dispute, and the mountains of uncollected garbage created serious health concerns. Then there was a terrorist threat. An anonymous tip warning of possible violence at the upcoming American Legionnaires Convention in protest against recent U.S. foreign policy decisions. That convention was to be headquartered here at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, one of Philadelphia's finest, and it was having some of its own problems.
Hello, I received a service call. I'm here to check the air conditioning. Sure, come on in.
The hotel's air conditioning system was malfunctioning, and repairmen were doing all they could to get it up and running before the convention. Hotel security was also working to make sure that prostitutes were kept away from the hotel during the busy summer season. On July 21st, 4,500 Legionnaires from around the state of Pennsylvania arrived in Philadelphia for their annual get-together. It was a time for business and to renew old friendships.
Everybody was looking forward to it, a jolly, jovial time where we naturally had meetings to attend and so forth, but normally the business would be over by noon, and we could then go out and visit the city.
I had been to 3 or 4 conventions, I think, in Pittsburgh, one in Harrisburg, and I really didn't know that much about Philly. I knew it's a big city. I was anxious, too.
After 3 days of business and pleasure, the 4,500 Legionnaires returned home. The convention had ended, but a mystery began to unfold.
Lord, welcome into your presence.
8 days later, in Williamstown, Pennsylvania, Legionnaires James Dolan and John Ralph died suddenly under mysterious circumstances. Both had attended the convention in Philadelphia.
I don't think we've had 2 Korean veterans die in the same year, let alone 2 days apart from each other.
The official cause of death, pneumonia. The coroner described their lungs as resembling Brillo pads. Within days, other Legionnaires fell ill.
I laid around the house for about 2 days, and I just kept feeling worse and worse. My oldest boy was there, and he said, "Dad, I'm taking you to the doctor. There must be something wrong with you."
The mysterious illness struck swiftly, first headache, then muscle and chest pain, and a fever which could get as high as 107 degrees. Within 3 weeks, 11 more Legionnaires died.
And I thought, boy, here I am. If I'm going to die, I mean, I had 5 kids. That makes you think a lot. And I thought, oh boy, I hope that's not me.
Authorities in the state capital of Harrisburg feared an epidemic and quickly called in the Centers for Disease Control to investigate. Dr. David Frazier led the investigation.
We had a situation which, when we first heard about the problem, there had been 4 deaths. Quickly thereafter, we heard of 11 deaths, and it increased from that point. So this was occurring from unknown cause in a major city in the United States, and had to have everybody's attention.
Frazier's first task, to find out why some Legionnaires were getting sick and others weren't.
Which, at its most basic, involves comparing what people did who became sick with what people did who stayed well.
The investigation would be complicated. The Legionnaires were spread throughout the state, and gathering information would be difficult. Dr. Frazier had some theories, but little else. The investigation into the death of the American Legionnaires would become the largest and most complicated medical investigation in history. By the time Dr. David Frazier and his team arrived in Philadelphia, the death rate among the infected Legionnaires was 20% and rising. 11 Legionnaires were dead, and 39 more were seriously ill. All of the Legionnaires who died had a form of pneumonia, but investigators had no idea what was causing it.
There are more deaths in Pennsylvania from a disease still not identified.
Because of the outbreak was worldwide news, and the press had given it a name.
Ever since the Legionnaire's disease became a major national story.
The daily press reports fueled the fear many citizens felt, and nowhere was that fear more evident than in the town of Monessen, Pennsylvania. Andrew Hornack was a bus driver who had driven a drum and bugle corps to the Legionnaires' convention in Philadelphia. After he arrived home, he fell ill and died from Legionnaire's disease. Although he was extremely popular, few of his friends went to pay their last respects.
Well, we've had a very sparse visitation at the funeral home because our people seem to feel that there might be some danger involved to their own life.
Dr. Lewis Polk was Philadelphia's health commissioner and understood people's fears.
If you deal with a catastrophe of a known cause, whether it's a flood, a fire, an earthquake, whatever, even though it may cause a lot of damage and even kill a lot of people, somehow as human beings, all of us can deal with a known cause catastrophe better than an unknown cause, a true mystery.
Dr. Frazier and the Centers for Disease Control needed to gather information. Investigators crisscrossed the state to interview sick Legionnaires.
At the Go-Getters breakfast on Friday, did you have the coffee?
Just the coffee, no rolls.
They sent detailed questionnaires to everyone who attended the convention.
On Friday the 23rd, how often did you ride the main elevators? Man, I don't know how many.
They collected hundreds of dust, air, water, and ice samples, as well as rat and pigeon droppings from every hotel used by the Legionnaires. Anything which might be of interest to the biologists and toxicologists of the CDC was sent to Atlanta for analysis. And tissue samples from the autopsies were also collected and analyzed. CDC investigators had plenty of competing theories. Swine flu was at the top of their list since the symptoms were similar. Parrot fever was also a possibility, a disease spread by sick pigeons. Perhaps a massive case of food poisoning caused by a problem at one of the convention's half-dozen hotels.
There were some thoughts early on that people in town for a convention possibly might have overindulged in one of several ways, whether it's drinking or sex or something.
Was it a new strain of venereal disease called supergonorrhea? The symptoms were similar to supergonorrhea, and there had been 2 outbreaks in other cities earlier that year. Or did the outbreak stem from the rats and the recent sanitation strike, which left mountains of uncollected garbage in the very streets the Legionnaires walked through? And what about the anonymous tip about a possible terrorist attack? Was it possible the Legionnaires had been poisoned? But one of the most puzzling questions was why some Legionnaires developed the disease while others did not. After Legionnaire Bob McGarry's roommate developed pneumonia, the CDC wanted him to get to a hospital right away.
When I told them what I was there for, they rolled out the red carpet and they gave me a physical like I never had before in my life. They wanted every type of saliva, urine, and anything else that I could give them to be sent to the Disease Control Center in Atlanta, Georgia.
What we found, though, in our survey of roommates was that being a roommate of somebody with Legionnaire's disease didn't increase your chance of getting Legionnaire's disease. And that was a very important finding, because it suggested that, first of all, exposure wasn't occurring in the bedrooms there, and it also suggested it wasn't spread person to person.
Within 48 hours, the first tissue specimens analyzed by the CDC eliminated typhoid, the Lassa and Marburg viruses, pertussis, and the plague. And after 5 days, they eliminated many more, including herpes, mumps and measles viruses, as well as some of their top suspects. Blood tests also eliminated the possibility that it was super gonorrhea. The CDC had eliminated a number of possibilities, but they still couldn't identify the killer. The questionnaires yielded some important information.
Among the various hotels we surveyed, the highest rate of illness that looked like Legionnaire's disease was among people who were registered at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, and specifically in the week of the American Legion Convention.
However, there were some victims of Legionnaire's disease who weren't Legionnaires at all, hadn't attended their convention, and never set foot inside the Bellevue Stratford Hotel.
There were people who walked along the sidewalk in front of the Bellevue Stratford who got sick, who never went inside, or on the street across the way. Indeed, we found that the more time people spent on the sidewalk in front of the Bellevue Stratford, the more likely they were to get sick.
But for some unknown reason, none of the employees of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel contracted the disease. What were the common factors among those who did? Most were over the age of 50. 17 of the first 21 fatalities were smokers, and some had other underlying illnesses. When Frazier reviewed the Bellevue Stratford's employees, he discovered that on average, they were 10 years younger and healthier than those who got sick. By now, 27 were dead. The death toll was mounting, and Frazier still had no idea what was killing these people or how it was being spread. Dr. Frazier and his team were convinced the outbreak of Legionnaire's disease had something to do with the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, but they hadn't found the connection.
It's just amazing. I just can't figure it out. Why some would get sick and others did not. Right. Because, as I said, I slept in the same room with two fellows that are dead.
Frazier believed that the agent or cause of the disease came from somewhere near the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. And since individuals on the street had also developed the disease, that told him something else.
We had some evidence that it was not waterborne or foodborne. And so we were developing the idea that this might be an airborne infection, but we had some additional questions to answer about that.
But if the agent was inside the hotel, Frazier's medical detectives couldn't find it. And since the outbreak was slowing down, he believed the cause might now be gone. His only hope was that the scientists in the lab could find it. At the University of Connecticut, Dr. William Sunderman received an anonymous letter saying that the Legionnaires were intentionally poisoned while in Philadelphia. Sunderman turned the letter over to the FBI, but Sunderman was an expert on nickel carbonyl, a clear, odorless liquid, easily transformed into a lethal gas. He did a little of his own research.
Nickel could spread through the air, that it certainly could cause pneumonia, that it caused a particular pattern of pneumonia that was not so different from what we were seeing in the Legionnaire's cases as to be obviously excludable.
Tests on liver samples revealed that nickel was present in those who died.
Dr. William Sunderman, the chief toxicologist doing the research work at the University of Connecticut, has pretty well established that it was nickel carbonyl.
But Dr. Sunderman's discovery was not the breakthrough. After days of testing, researchers suspected that nickel was peeling off of the scalpels used during the autopsies. When plastic scalpels were used, the nickel was no longer present. Investigators were no closer to finding the cause of Legionnaire's disease.
There is a possibility that we may never find the answer However, I will pledge, and I'm sure Dr. Sensor would, that this effort and investigation will continue if it takes a year or 2 years to continue the investigation to get to the bottom of it.
Over the Christmas holidays, some of the CDC staff decided to take some much-needed time off. They had been working around the clock to find the cause of the Legionnaire's outbreak without success. There were no new cases of Legionnaire's disease, but still no answers. Dr. Joseph McDade, a CDC microbiologist, and his wife were looking forward to the Christmas holidays.
Joe, it's been 6 months since this first broke out.
But what should have been a diversion turned to frustration as friends asked why he and his colleagues were unable to find the cause of the outbreak.
Come on, honey. I think
Frustrated, angry, and embarrassed, McDade canceled his Christmas vacation and returned to his lab. He pulled the slide of a guinea pig which had been injected with liver tissue from a Legionnaire's victim. It was a slide he had seen hundreds of times before. But this time, in his deserted lab, he noticed something he didn't recognize. A new bacterium, one Dr. McDade had never seen before. Dr. Joseph McDade, a CDC microbiologist, saw something he never noticed before as he examined tissues of guinea pigs exposed to the mysterious disease. But at first, he thought he was looking at a contaminated specimen.
So they were probably some other kind of bacteria. And he, as I understand it, decided to retest those specimens, no longer assuming that these were contaminants, but on the off chance that this was the agent.
He tested his newfound organism with a blood sample from a Legionnaire's disease survivor. That blood sample would contain antibodies which successfully fought the disease. If the antibodies were present, the sample would turn green. McDade looked through the microscope and saw a bright green glow.
So he demonstrated that the bug was present in the liver of the guinea pig, and he demonstrated that Legionnaires developed antibodies that were specific to that agent. Well, that was the breakthrough.
147 days after the outbreak, the bacterium, which killed 34 and hospitalized 221 others, was officially given its name, Legionella pneumophila, in honor of the Legionnaires in Philadelphia. And researchers identified an antibiotic which would kill it, erythromycin. But the question remained, where did the bacteria come from, and how was it spread? By the time researchers knew what they were looking for, they couldn't find it in any of the samples from the hotel. The bacteria had long since died. But researchers quickly discovered its properties. It multiplied in warm, watery conditions and could travel through the air in contaminated water droplets or mist. Since some of the victims never set foot inside the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, but were on the sidewalk in front of the hotel, Dr. Frazier believes that the bacteria most likely came from the roof of the hotel, from the air conditioning water cooling towers. Inside the cooling towers, warm water is cooled as it cascades over wooden louvers. The excess water falls into a collection pan at the bottom, where it stagnates if it fails to drain properly. Investigators believe it was here, inside these water cooling units, where the deadly Legionella bacteria grew and multiplied. It was drawn up into the air by the unit's powerful fans. Now airborne, the deadly mist of bacteria and warm water flew up into the atmosphere and floated down the side of the building, making its way to the street below. It landed on pedestrians walking by the hotel and was also drawn into the hotel lobby by intake fans on the south side of the building. Hotel employees probably developed an immunity to the bacteria or weren't susceptible because they were younger and healthier than those who contracted the disease. The cooling tower theory was never proven, probably because the bacteria in the Bellevue Stratford's cooling towers had already died. But investigators discovered the same bacteria in similar cooling towers in other parts of the country. Scientists believe Legionella has been killing for thousands of years. And when blood samples from earlier unexplained outbreaks were examined, they discovered the Legionella bacteria. Austin, Minnesota, 1957, the earliest documented outbreak. Washington, D.C., 1965, where Legionella killed 16 people. Bob McGarry and Charlie Davis were two of the more fortunate Legionnaires from the 1976 convention. Charlie Davis developed Legionnaire's disease, spent 3 weeks in the hospital, but recovered. Bob McGarry escaped the disease altogether, even though he and Charlie roomed together. Bob was younger, didn't smoke, or have any previous respiratory ailments. But the outbreak had a lasting effect on these two lifelong friends. They lost many of their brothers that summer, and neither one ever attended another Legionnaire's convention.
I was at the wrong place at the right time, as far as that was concerned.
Had it not been for the unfortunate incident that occurred with the rest of the delegates and brothers, I could say today it was a great time, but I was not going to press my luck. I seen it once, I don't want to do it again.
On the night of May 22, 1992, Betty Wilson returned home immediately after her Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. She had some last-minute packing to do for a vacation she was taking the next day with her husband. As she walked up the stairs, headed for her bedroom, she found her husband lying in a pool of blood. Clearly, Jack Wilson had been murdered, but how? Experts couldn't agree.
I went up the steps, and as I rounded the top of the stairs with my head down and looking up to turn on the light, I saw Jack lying in the floor.
Betty Wilson immediately ran to a neighbor's house and called 911.
Listen, this is the police department. Talk to me, okay? Were you in the house or did you walk in the house? Okay, you come home and you walk in the house and you saw this person laying on the floor. Who is the person to you? Okay, do you know if the person that hurt him is still inside?
I don't know. I got a
Okay. Now you just go stand there and you don't go back to your house, okay? And we've got an ambulance and we've got the police on the way.
The Huntsville, Alabama police arrived at the murder scene within minutes of the call.
Lying in the hallway was a white male who appeared to have been beaten and also stabbed. He was laying in a puddle of blood there in the hallway.
Lying next to the body, the apparent murder weapon, a 34-inch long metal baseball bat covered with blood. but police couldn't locate the weapon used to stab him. In Jack Wilson's bedroom, the telephone line had been cut, and a green ski mask was found on top of the bed. They also found an open pistol box with ammunition, but no sign of the gun. There were no indications the Wilson home had been explored for valuables. No drawers had been emptied, no closet searched. Jack Wilson's wallet was on the floor near his shoes. There was no cash inside, but his credit cards were. If the motive wasn't burglary, why was Jack Wilson murdered? Wilson was a 55-year-old eye doctor, very successful, well-known, and well-loved in the community.
I'd even hate to estimate how many people that Jack treated absolutely free because they needed medical help and they couldn't afford to pay.
Jack and Betty Wilson had been married for about 14 years. Each had 3 children from previous marriages.
We were happy and satisfied with each other. He met every need that I or my children or my grandchildren had. He was a wonderful person.
He was sincere, he was honest, straightforward. He was fun to be with.
As police began searching for clues, homicide detectives learned a shocking piece of information. The county sheriff's office had received a tip just the day before. An informant in the small town of Vincent, Alabama, said she overheard a conversation that a man from Vincent had been hired to kill a doctor. That information led police on a long, convoluted journey from the backwoods of Alabama to one of its finest neighborhoods. It ended in a bitter courtroom dispute because of 2 conflicting interpretations of what happened during Jack Wilson's last moments alive. The body of Jack Wilson was transported to the state medical examiner in Birmingham for a routine autopsy. Dr. Joseph Embry noted a series of lacerations on Wilson's head and a fractured skull. Wilson had also suffered a fractured hyoid bone in his neck and a fractured right shoulder with a puncture wound clearly visible. Both arms were fractured. These were defensive-type wounds, indicating Wilson tried to fend off his attacker, and there were 2 stab wounds in his abdomen. Officially, the cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head. The Huntsville Police Serology Lab identified the blood found on the bat to be the same blood type as Jack Wilson, but they didn't find any fingerprints. Next, police turned to the information they received before the murder.
We had a concerned citizen in the county that overheard a conversation that Mr. White had stated that he was going to Huntsville over the weekend to kill someone.
Huntsville police drove to Vincent, Alabama, about 100 miles away, to interview James White. He lived in a trailer on the outskirts of town. James White was a handyman at the Vincent Elementary School where his children attended classes. Betty Wilson's twin sister, Peggy Lowe, taught first grade at the same school. White had a past criminal record, a history of drug and alcohol abuse, and a dishonorable discharge from the military. Police interrogated White for 10 hours, and he admitted being inside the Wilson home the night of the murder.
Been drinking for the last 3 or 4 days, popping pills, drinking, smoking dope. And all I knew is I wanted to get away. They say the man got beat with a baseball bat, but I don't remember a baseball bat being around nowhere. But I do remember that I hit the man, he turned me loose.
Before police returned to Huntsville, they searched White's trailer. They found a pair of shoes with a blood stain, which later matched Jack Wilson's blood type. In the abandoned house next door, police discovered a revolver, which was registered to Betty Wilson. And in James White's truck, a book of poetry from the Huntsville Public Library, which had been signed out by Betty Wilson. Police arrested James White and charged him in the murder of Jack Wilson. Then, a shocking disclosure. James White told police that Betty Wilson and her twin sister Peggy Lowe had hired him to kill Jack Wilson for $5,000. Betty Wilson and Peggy Lowe were immediately picked up for questioning.
The police came, they jerked me around. They jerked my watch off of my arm and threw it across the room, saying, "You won't need this where you're going."
As police looked for a motive, rumors surfaced about the unconventional relationship between Jack and Betty Wilson. They lived separate lives with separate bedrooms and not much of a sexual relationship. Betty admitted to police she had a number of affairs while married to Jack. Jack Wilson suffered from Crohn's disease and wore an ostomy bag, which Betty admitted to friends she found repulsive. And in the mind of police, perhaps the strongest motive of all, Betty Wilson would receive the bulk of her husband's $6 million estate. The star witness, James White, without whom there was no case against the sisters, cut a deal with the prosecution, and he even had it in writing. He would implicate Betty Wilson and Peggy Lowe in return for a reduced sentence. The sisters were tried separately. Betty Wilson went on trial first. According to James White's testimony and the prosecution's interpretation of the autopsy findings, James White entered the Wilsons' home and waited in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Jack Wilson arrived home around 5 p.m., and neighbors saw him step out to the front yard to hammer a campaign poster into the lawn with a baseball bat. He then walked back inside the house and headed upstairs to his bedroom. White says he changed his mind and decided not to murder Wilson, but as he was leaving, encountered him in the hallway. The two struggled. White grabbed the baseball bat and struck Wilson in the head. He was then stabbed twice in the abdomen. White said Betty Wilson met him outside and drove him to his truck. However, police forensic experts found no evidence of White's hair, clothing fibers, or even a fingerprint inside Betty Wilson's car. Lacking any strong physical evidence, the prosecution attacked Betty Wilson's character, and they subpoenaed one of her ex-lovers to testify about their adulterous relationship. The jury found Betty Wilson guilty of capital murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole.
I think Miss Wilson was convicted on her personal conduct. She couldn't have been convicted on the evidence. I mean, the physical evidence was not there to support it.
The prosecution's next task, to try Betty's twin sister, Peggy Lowe, for the same crime. All of the witnesses and evidence against her would be similar, but what they hadn't bargained for was the testimony of a defense expert who would drop a forensic bombshell, that Jack Wilson was not murdered in the way the prosecution said. 8 months after Betty Wilson was convicted of murder for hire, her twin sister, Peggy Lowe, went on trial for the same crime. This time, the prosecution couldn't attack the defendant's lifestyle. Peggy Lowe was a first-grade school teacher. She and her husband were active in the local church, and she was even the lead singer with the church choir. She had a long history of helping those in need.
My friends did for me what I couldn't do for myself. When I could no longer cry, they cried for me. When I couldn't pray, they prayed for me.
Peggy Lowe's attorneys had time to look for new evidence and to go over the testimony from her sister's trial. One of the things they noticed was that James White never admitted killing Jack Wilson.
The detectives told me that I hit him with a baseball bat or I had to hit him with something other heavy. And I think I told them that I kept reaching until I got something other, and I hit the man and he turned me loose and I left.
That was just one of the things that bothered Peggy Lowe's defense team. The other was the crime scene.
How could this man beat this man so badly with a baseball bat that he broke his arms and stabbed him and beat his head terribly, and there not be any blood splatter patterns?
The defense took the autopsy report and crime scene photos to Georgia and showed them to Atlanta's deputy medical examiner.
And if someone is being struck with a blunt instrument to cause lacerations like this, there's going to be a spray of blood that is not only sprayed when the instrument strikes the head or strikes the arm, but also as the instrument is raised back, there's going to be a spray pattern that will go upwards onto the wall or onto the ceiling. And I was really struck by the fact that I could not really ascertain any significant spray pattern at all.
Dr. Sperry agreed to testify at Peggy Lowe's trial. James White once again told his story. But this time, he was severely challenged by the defense.
The whole case rested on a man's testimony. The man is a liar, a child molester, shot his own men in Vietnam. He's been on psychedelic drugs. He's a drunk. He's a dope addict. He's a cocaine user.
The other strong defense challenge came against the state medical examiner who did the autopsy.
The story that the murderer told didn't make sense. Not only did they not make practical sense, they didn't make scientific sense. And I believe that juries like scientific evidence.
But the most startling testimony was that of Dr. Chris Sperry.
When a blunt instrument of any sort is used to strike the head repeatedly, it is very, very common. In fact, with repeated blows, almost always you will have not only transfer of blood from the lacerations onto the instrument, but hair as well. And finding hair embedded in blood that's on the surface of the blunt instrument, such as the bat, would be very, very significant.
There was no hair that I know of that was found on the bat. Parts of skull, I don't know of any, but all they did was the blood typing on the bat.
But Dr. Sperry went even further, saying he doubted that the bat was the murder weapon at all. And James White never admitted using the bat.
Looking at the injuries that Dr. Wilson had, I felt that the injury pattern, that is the lacerations and the fractures beneath these lacerations, were not of the type that would typically be caused by a baseball bat. Baseball bats cause crushing injuries of the head and will actually crush in the bones of the skull, just like an egg is being crushed.
The linear patterns of the wounds to Dr. Wilson's scalp led Dr. Sperry to conclude that it was more likely a fireplace poker that was used on Jack Wilson. This would also explain the puncture wound found on Dr. Wilson's shoulder.
This was rather unusual in and of itself, and no one really had an explanation for that particular injury. But when you think about a fireplace poker, that many of them are designed with a sort of a hook or a point that sticks out at a 90-degree angle, suddenly that also made sense, and it fit together with the whole pattern.
The autopsy report indicated that Dr. Wilson's hyoid bone had been fractured. Sperry believed Wilson had also been strangled.
It didn't make a damn how Dr. Wilson got killed. The question was, who did it? And James White admitted to doing it, whether he stomped him, beat him with a bat, beat him with a stick. But that's the type of bull that experts try and sell to juries.
He had a theory that there was 2 to 3 people that brought the body back to the scene and dumped it there on the scene, which was utterly, to me, ridiculous.
What killed Dr. Wilson was not the issue. The issue was, did Betty Wilson and Peggy Lowe conspire with James White to kill Jack Wilson? And Sperry brings in this photograph of something that happened in a book and shows the jury and says, oh, it couldn't have been a bat. What difference does it make? Dr. Wilson was beaten to death.
But to convict Peggy Lowe, the jury would have to believe James White. And if Dr. Sperry was correct, the murder didn't happen the way James White said. There were now 2 scenarios as to how Jack Wilson was murdered. Neighbors saw him on the front lawn around 5 p.m., hammering the political poster into the ground with a baseball bat. Using Dr. Sperry's interpretation, he was then attacked by at least 2 individuals. During the struggle, Wilson's hyoid bone was fractured. He was struck at least 9 times in the head and at least once in the shoulder, creating the puncture wound in the back of his neck. Then stabbed twice in the abdomen. The body was then placed in a tarp and carried into the house, dropped onto the wooden floor, and then turned 180 degrees. His head brushed against the doorway molding, leaving a blood stain and the swirling blood pattern on the floor. They smeared blood onto the bat so it would look like the murder weapon, took the fireplace poker and knife, and fled. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours.
Ladies and gentlemen, have you arrived at a verdict? Yes, sir. Would you read the verdict for me, please?
With the jury, found the defendant not guilty.
It was such a relief. I cried so hard people thought that she had gotten a guilty verdict. But they were tears of joy and relief.
But how could Doctors Sperry and Embry come to such different conclusions? We asked 2 board-certified forensic pathologists to review the autopsy report as well as the crime scene photographs. They both agreed the autopsy Dr. Embry performed was flawless. It just wasn't enough. Forensic science begins at the crime scene, and the fact the police and the prosecution never showed Dr. Embry the bat or the crime scene photographs until just a few days before the first trial was a serious mistake. Both experts suggested that a thorough forensic examination of the crime scene might have revealed the cause of the puncture wound on Wilson's shoulder, but the 2 experts disagreed about the bat. One was bothered by the lack of Jack Wilson's hair on it. The other wasn't. Dr. Walter Hoffman feels the lack of a thorough forensic crime scene examination opened the door for the defense.
If the law enforcement agency doesn't ask for help and does it all on its own and then ships the body in for autopsy, a certain vital amount of information has been lost. You lose the ability to really evaluate the scene as it is found in a virginal state before anyone has walked around it and done anything with it.
Dr. Embry, who performed the autopsy on Jack Wilson, didn't visit the crime scene. Although Dr. Embry continues to stand by his findings, he declined the opportunity to defend those findings for this program. After Peggy Lowe's acquittal, James White recanted his confession. In a signed affidavit, he said he never met or even spoke with Betty Wilson, that he was never propositioned by Peggy Lowe to murder Dr. Jack Wilson, and that he made it all up. But he now says he was coerced into signing that statement and has gone back to his original version. He remains in an Alabama prison, eligible for parole in just a few years.
I pleaded guilty to the case, but I didn't kill the man, but I knew about the situation. So in a sense, I felt like that I'm here for the right reason.
James Denison White would have sold his soul to get a good deal and avoid the electric chair. I believe that's exactly what he did.
2 sisters, 2 trials, the same forensic evidence, yet 2 different verdicts. Betty Wilson has been in prison for the last 4 years, serving a life sentence with no chance of parole. Her first appeal was turned down. Another is pending. Peggy Lowe hopes for the day her sister will get a new trial.
There's nobody there who cares anything about her. There's nobody to put their arms around her. There's nowhere for her to cry. There's no privacy. And the more things like that I realize, the more pain I feel for her.
It was a nightmare and it hasn't ended yet. I don't know that it'll ever end. Not for me, not for my children, for my precious grandchildren or my mother. It'll never end. Never.
Between 1985 and 1988, 18 transients, hitchhikers, and prostitutes were choked, sexually molested, and left for dead in the desert mountains of California. The only witnesses, the insects of the desert. And they also turned out to be extremely important pieces of evidence. The women who had been choked, unconscious, and sexually molested were all dumped and left for dead in the high desert mountains near San Diego, California. Not all of the victims died, and those who survived all described the same scenario.
Several of them had their pants undone and pulled down. Bras were moved up, exposing their breasts. One lady had a nipple ring removed. So we thought there had been some sort of sexual activity, but because they were unconscious, we had no proof of it.
Betty Bass was one of the victims.
Nice seeing you too, love. Bye-bye.
She's had a history of mental problems and is currently homeless. But she can vividly recall the night 8 years ago when she accepted a ride from a stranger. After leaving this motel on El Cajon Boulevard, she looked for a ride going towards Ramona, California. A man in a silver car pulled up and offered to take her part way.
I can take you as far as El Centro.
Good enough.
He had a clean car, so I thought, you know, that's a pretty good guy, pretty nice guy, you know. I just thought he was okay.
As they drove over the mountains, the driver said he needed to pull off the highway to take a bathroom break. When the driver walked around the car, he asked Betty to grab something from the back seat. As she did, he wrapped his arm around her neck and choked her. The last thing she remembers was losing consciousness. When she woke up, she walked up this hill looking for help.
So I walked and I walked and I walked. Well, I finally crawled over this fence. I crawled to the other side of the street. Some family came by and put me in their motorhome and aided me up a little bit, and then they took me to the hospital.
But the scene of the attack is right here in the dirt, right by this little knoll. The car tire tracks stopped back here a few feet, and then you could see footprints up into this area. Her clothing, some of her clothing was found here.
Police photographed the shoe and tire prints and also recovered 2 Marlboro cigarette butts. On Betty Bass's shirt, detectives noticed a tiny red carpet fiber. This attack sounded identical to another in the same vicinity just 1 month earlier. 2 young girls were hitchhiking together at a restaurant near the interstate highway. A silver compact automobile pulled up and a middle-aged man offered them a ride.
Where are you girls gone?
We're heading to Tucson.
Take you as far as El Centro.
Great.
Hop in.
It was a ride they'll never forget.
It was my friend. He strangled her.
Do you have any idea who he is?
The guy who picked us up hitchhiking.
This girl was fortunate. She survived her attack, and her friend, whom she feared was dead, was later found in the desert, frightened but alive. The victims all provided a similar description of their attacker.
He was about early 40s, short hair, blondish grayish color, glasses. That's how they all described him. Obviously, these were people who were going to take rides from anyone, but many of them told us that they felt comfortable getting in the car with him.
And there were other similarities with all of these attacks.
The things he said to these women, it was almost like he had a script. It was almost the same type of scenario. I can only take you 40 miles. I'm only going to El Centro.
The type of people he was victimizing were the vulnerable people in society. Some people who were having mental problems, drug addicts, street people, hitchhikers.
Police had a description of the suspect, some tire tracks, and shoe print evidence, but little else. A sexual predator was loose in the mountains of California. San Diego's El Cajon Boulevard, where prostitutes, runaways, and transients have congregated for years. The reason? Location. It's close to a highway entrance ramp, convenient for hitchhikers looking for a ride. And it was here where many of the victims were picked up.
We had a series of live victims, and we also had dead victims out there who we thought were part of the pattern. We had what we thought was a pretty consistent pattern, common footprints, common tire tracks, same type of victims being victimized, and certainly the same area where they're being picked up and dumped.
When detectives were called to Sheepshead Mountain on July 21, 1988, they feared another in the series of choke and dump cases. This time, the victim was dead and nude from the waist down.
She was found laying on the road here. This was more dug out at the time. The graders come in here every so often, and she was more in the ditch type of thing.
The victim had been dead for quite some time. Her skin was brown and blistered from the sun. Her legs and feet were covered with blood. It appeared the victim was alive before falling into the ditch because impressions of her arms flailing were found in the dirt. Detectives noticed a blood trail and her bare footprints leading almost a mile up the mountain. At the top of the mountain, detectives found a pair of shoes, some clothing, 2 sets of footprints, and signs of a struggle. The footprints led detectives to a parking area where they noticed a tire track. It looked as if a car had turned around before leaving the scene. The victim's bare footprints led from the clearing into the brush.
Somehow, she gets herself out of this area and then comes back up and then finds her way down the main road.
On the body, investigators discovered some tiny clues. Hundreds of live, worm-like creatures. They were carefully collected and preserved, then taken to the forensics lab for analysis. Was it possible these tiny insects could tell forensic scientists something about the victim's last moments alive, or even when she was killed? The autopsy revealed that the victim had probably been choked, but strangulation wasn't the cause of death.
The cause of death was actually a laceration of the vagina. The mechanism would have been blood loss from that laceration.
The victim was identified as Sandra Swick, a 43-year-old transient from Florida. Swick's body was found in the same general vicinity as many of the other choke and dump victims. All were found the same distance from the interstate highway, usually near a V in the road where the attacker could park without being seen by others. Detectives still didn't have a suspect, but 3 months after Swick's murder, detectives got an unexpected break. While patrolling in the mountains, Sheriff's Deputy Larry Daly noticed a car driving out of a deserted side road.
And as I came around the bend here, I could see the car coming out.
Daly turned onto the side road and saw a woman lying in the dirt, unconscious but still alive.
I saw the victim laying on the ground, pants down past her knees, her shirt pulled up to her neck, as if someone had choked her.
Daly immediately called for an ambulance and put out a description of the car he saw driving from the scene. After 3 years of frustration, could this be the break investigators were hoping for? After finding the body of an unconscious woman in the desert, Sheriff's Deputy Larry Daly rushed to his vehicle and called for help.
I also called out the description of the vehicle that I saw coming down the road towards me.
A short time later, this silver Honda was stopped by an officer who heard the call.
What I wanted to see was I wanted to see a monster. I wanted to see this monstrous man, maybe someone with 3 arms, who came out and was abducting women and strangling them.
The driver was 41-year-old Ronald Porter, an automotive mechanic with a history of sexual offenses. The woman found unconscious in the desert survived her attack and was able to identify Porter as her attacker. Porter confessed to the attack, but would not admit to any of the other attacks over the past 3 years. Investigators believed Porter was responsible, and they also suspected that Porter had murdered Sandra Swick 3 months earlier. To find out if all these crimes were the work of one individual, San Diego authorities sought help from the FBI and their unit, which specializes in studying serial murderers.
That another offender would choose to abduct the same type of victim, bring it to the same type of location, do the same types of acts with them in the same locations, almost exact locations. It became pretty evident to us that the probabilities favored it being one person.
Larry Ankrum identified the remote desert dump sites as the signature element of all of the crimes. The attacker invested lots of time and effort into finding these remote locations. Another signature element was the type of women he chose.
He's making an assessment before he decides he's going to go ahead and ask her if she needs a ride. And when he's made that initial impression, then once he's decided, yeah, I can control this victim, then she gets in the car, and then it becomes somewhat of a game with him to get her where he wants to go.
The FBI was convinced that all of these crimes were indeed the work of the same individual. The next step was for San Diego authorities to prove that Ronald Porter committed these crimes. The carpet fibers in Porter's car were microscopically similar to the red carpet fiber found on the blouse of Betty Bass. Tire tracks found at some of the crime scenes were similar to the print on the spare Michelin tire found in the trunk of Porter's car. And when searching Porter's apartment, police found shoes and boots with tread marks consistent with those found at some of the choke and dump crime scenes. A walkie-talkie discovered in Porter's storage shed belonged to a woman who was choked and dumped in the desert mountains a few years earlier, and the blouse worn by that same victim contained a semen stain. A DNA analysis of Ronald Porter's blood matched the semen stain from the blouse. But despite all of this evidence, prosecutors faced a major legal problem. By the time police arrested Ronald Porter, the statute of limitations on most of these assault cases had run out. If prosecutors were going to send Porter to jail for any length of time, it would have to be for the murder of Sandra Swick. But the Swick murder was their weakest case. Investigators found no semen, no blood, no hair or clothing fibers which could link Ronald Porter to the Swick crime scene. A tire track found at the Sandra Swick attack site was too faint for analysis. However, some of the tennis shoe prints found at the Swick crime scene were similar to a pair of tennis shoes found in Ronald Porter's apartment. But Porter's attorney says a similar tennis shoe print is inconclusive.
But 5 million other people with similar shoes, with similar treads, could also have made the print.
And the prosecution faced another problem. They weren't exactly sure when Sandra Swick was murdered.
Time of death determination by pathologists is a very inexact science, if it's a science at all. There are certain changes the body undergoes, and we can predict general time frames for those, but there's a lot of different variables that affect it.
If prosecutors wanted to convict Ronald Porter of murder, they needed more. Could the tiny insects found on Swick's body tell forensic scientists when Sandra Swick died and tie Ronald Porter to her murder? When detectives found Sandra Swick's body on Sheepshead Mountain, it was badly decomposed. The hot desert air and sun had taken its toll, and hundreds of tiny worm-like creatures were feeding on her decomposing flesh. Investigators wondered if these tiny creatures might offer some clues about when Sandra Swick died. Detectives collected about 100 of these creatures and sent them to the laboratory of David Faulkner. He's a forensic entomologist, an expert on insect activity on dead bodies.
They can tell you lots about where they've been, where the victim's been, how old the victim is, conditions of the body following death. And those are the things that are interesting.
Faulkner's first task was to determine the age of these creatures, or maggots as they're called, so he preserved some in alcohol at the exact stage of development as when they were found. Eventually, the maggots would shrink and develop a hard shell, and a week later emerge as a winged adult. Once Faulkner had an adult, he could compare it to the hundreds of different flies which inhabit the California desert where Swick's body was found. After hours of study and analysis, Faulkner identified them. The flies were sarcophaga, also known as flesh flies.
Other things this particular group of flies will do is they'll fly in very bad weather. So if it's foggy or rainy or overcast, they'll be active and they'll be searching out a potential host. Whereas other flies will probably settle and wait until the sun comes out or till it gets warmer.
Once Faulkner knew they were sarcophaga, he could study the exact time frame of their life cycle. The preserved specimens were in their third or final stage of larval development.
Once you have them identified, you know what stage in development the most developed ones are, then you go backwards and say, okay, this was the temperature regime at that time. This is how long this particular insect takes to develop to this stage. Therefore, that body was available to these insects for this amount of time. Usually, that indicates how long the person's been dead.
In normal weather conditions, it takes a week for the baby maggots to develop to their third stage. But the weather conditions in the desert are far from normal. During the week Sandra Swick's body was discovered, the daytime temperatures averaged 92 degrees. In 92-degree weather, it would take only 3.5 days for the freshly laid maggots to develop to their third and final stage. And Faulkner was able to tell investigators something else. The sarcophaga never deposit their maggots in the dark. They only do so in daylight.
I'm going to Florida.
This meant that Sandra Swick was still alive when the sun set on Sunday evening, July 17th. But she was dead by daybreak on Monday morning, July 18th. At the first sign of light, these flesh flies were attracted to the chemical scent of Swick's decomposing flesh and immediately laid their maggots.
The maggots would not have been as developed if she had been alive longer. If she had been alive Monday afternoon, Monday evening, there's no way that these flies under those temperature conditions could have developed to that stage.
Faulkner's conclusions provided police with a scientific time frame for Swick's murder. Now, detectives could investigate Ronald Porter's whereabouts during the time of Swick's death. Porter worked as a mechanic at this automotive chain store. When his timesheets were subpoenaed, they revealed he was not at work on Sunday, July 17th. In addition, Porter provided no alibi regarding his whereabouts on that day.
And it matched up. We had a time period where Ron Porter was available to drive from north part of the county down to pick up Sandra Swick and transport her to East County.
Based on the insect clues and the similarities between the Swick murder and the other cases, Ronald Porter was charged in the murder of Sandra Swick. Prosecutors believe Ronald Porter picked up Swick as she hitchhiked somewhere near an entrance ramp to Interstate 8.
I'm going to Florida.
Jump in. I can take you about 40 miles to El Centro.
That'd be great.
How you doing?
Good.
As the car traveled east into the mountains, Porter pulled off the main highway onto a dark, deserted road. He may have used some excuse, as he did in other cases, possibly the need to take a bathroom break. As he walked around the back of the car, he surprised Swick from behind. Grabbing her around the neck in a military-type chokehold, he pulled her from the car and choked her until she was unconscious. He threw her to the ground, removed her clothes, and sexually assaulted her with his hand. He then returned to his car and fled. Sometime later, Swick regained consciousness. Dizzy, disoriented, and bleeding heavily from the attack, Swick walked barefoot down the dark, deserted road, walking almost a mile before collapsing. The blood trail was almost 1 mile long, and she bled to death from lacerations suffered during the assault.
Her death had to be a tough one. Very difficult, long, dying process that she went through.
And the insect clues were able to provide detectives with the time of death, something they were unable to determine by any other means.
Find the defendant, Ronald Elliott Porter, guilty of the crime of murder.
Ronald Porter was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Sandra Swick and was sentenced to 28 years to life in prison. Ronald Porter continues to maintain his innocence. The insect clues were an important element in their case against Ronald Porter, and they told David Faulkner all he needed to know about Sandra Swick's brutal attack and murder.
You get a lot of information from them, whether a body's been moved, how long the person's been dead, or how long the body has been available to insects, whether the body's been buried, whether the person took drugs, whether they had been poisoned. All these different sorts of things could be in the insects that are collected or removed from the body.